Story 1, The Wrong Kind of Apocalypse. I came back on a Tuesday. I know because the television was tuned to the morning news, and the anchor was wearing a red blazer she only ever wore on Tuesdays. I'd noticed that small ritual in my first life, somewhere between the coffee going cold and the argument that would never quite end. The anchor was smiling. Nothing had happened yet. I was lying on the family sofa with a crocheted blanket over my legs, the kind my mother had made in the years before her eyesight began to fail. The living room smelled of dish soap and the faint ghost of burnt toast, and I lay there for a full 30 seconds just breathing, cataloging the specific texture of alive. My hands, the ache in my lower back from the sofa's sunken cushion. The sound of my brother Jason's voice carrying from the kitchen. 1 month. That was what I had. 1 month before the temperature dropped and kept dropping, before the mercury hit levels that the old books used to say were scientifically impossible for an inhabited Earth. -70 Celsius. A cold that didn't just kill you, it solved you the way an equation is solved, with a finality that left no remainders. I had died in the cold. I remembered every minute of it. I sat up. My mother, Pamela, was in the armchair across from me, watching the news with the sound low. My father, Warren, was standing near the window with his hands in his pockets, the way he stood when he was thinking about something he didn't quite want to say out loud. Jason was coming in from the kitchen with a bowl of cereal, dropping himself into the other chair with the boneless ease of a man who had no idea the world was about to end. "You're up," my mother said. She was already watching me in that particular way she had, not suspicious, just attentive. She'd always been able to read me. "I'm up," I said. Jason didn't look at me. He was scrolling his phone with one hand and eating with the other, and I watched him for a moment and felt something complicated move through me. Not anger yet, not quite, something more like the particular exhaustion of already knowing how a conversation is going to go. "Cassie," he said, still not looking up. "I've been thinking about the apartment." I figured. Now he looked up. He had the expression he always wore when he believed he was about to say something reasonable, a kind of practiced patience, like a man explaining traffic laws to a pedestrian. "Look, I've been doing a lot of research. A lot. The signals are all pointing the same direction. Thermal events. Atmospheric pressure readings from the last 6 months. It's coming, and when it does, you're going to want to be somewhere with good ventilation, not some box up on the 14th floor that's going to trap heat." I let him finish. "You need to sign the apartment over," he said. "I have plans for it. I can set it up properly for the heat. You can stay with Mom and Dad, they've got more space." My mother made a small sound that wasn't quite agreement and wasn't quite objection. My father kept his hands in his pockets. "I'm not signing the apartment over," I said. Jason set his bowl down. "Cassie, I'm not signing anything." I said it without heat, without the defensive edge I might have had in my first life. I was simply stating a fact, the way you'd state the time. "But I appreciate you sharing your research." The argument that followed was not different from arguments I'd had before. I sat through it the way you sit through weather, present, patient, waiting for it to pass. Jason was certain. He'd always been certain. It was one of his defining qualities. In his previous life, and apparently in this one, he'd already decided what was coming, and no amount of actual evidence would reroute him once he'd committed to a theory. My mother mediated. My father offered gentle, forgettable observations. I listened to all of it and said nothing useful. That afternoon, while Jason went to photograph outdoor fans on sale at a hardware store and my parents drove to the pharmacy, I called a real estate agent. I sold my apartment in 8 days. The market was still healthy. It always was, right up until it wasn't. And I took a clean offer from a couple who wanted it for their eldest son and paid me slightly above asking. With that money, and the modest savings I'd never touched, I rented the penthouse unit on the top floor of the Elmwood residential tower. Thick poured concrete walls, triple-paned windows that had been installed 2 years earlier during a renovation push, ceiling height that allowed for actual insulation layering. The building management didn't think it strange that I wanted to move in immediately and pay 3 months upfront. People made unusual decisions all the time. I made 2 trips to the outdoor supply warehouse on Henderson Avenue and 1 trip to the restaurant supply depot off Route 9. Camping stoves, propane canisters, freeze-dried food in quantities that filled the second bedroom floor to ceiling, wool blankets by the case. Foam insulation panels I pressed into every window frame and sealed with weather strip tape. A hand-cranked emergency radio, a small library of paperback novels I'd been meaning to read since my 20s and never had. On the 8th day, I went down to the corner grocery on the first floor of my new building to buy coffee and found Grandma Louise. She was standing at the end of the canned goods aisle, holding a can of chicken broth with both hands, reading the label with an expression I recognized immediately. It was the expression of someone doing arithmetic, not about nutrition facts, but about time, about how long something needed to last. "Excuse me," I said, because I didn't know how else to begin. "Are you buying for the cold?" She looked at me over the top of the can. She was a small woman, probably in her early 70s, with close-cropped white hair and reading glasses on a beaded chain. Her eyes were sharp in the way that eyes get when a person has had decades to practice seeing clearly. "The cold," she said. "Yes, that's what I call it too." We stood in the canned goods aisle for 20 minutes. She'd had the dream, or the premonition, or whatever it was. I had stopped trying to name it about 3 weeks ago. She'd been preparing quietly since then, telling no one, because she was old enough to know exactly how that conversation went. She'd been buying a few extra cans a day so as not to draw attention. She lived alone in a studio on the 3rd floor. She'd been worried about the pipes. I told her about the penthouse. She looked at me for a long moment, and then she nodded once, and I understood that she'd decided to trust me, and that this was not a thing she did lightly. "There's a girl," she said. "Maya. She's on the 2nd floor, unit 204. She's 15. Her mother left 2 months ago and hasn't called. She's been feeding herself on microwave rice and whatever I bring her." "She comes with us," I said. Maya was quiet in the way that teenagers are quiet when they've learned that speaking up doesn't reliably produce good results. She was slight, with dark eyes that moved quickly around any new space she entered, cataloging exits and potential problems. When Grandma Louise brought her to the penthouse and showed her the 2nd bedroom with the stacked food supplies and the foam-sealed windows, she stood in the doorway for a moment and then said in a very small voice, "You're not going to make me leave?" "No," I said. "You live here now." She helped me stack propane canisters after that without being asked. I thought she was probably going to be fine. The day before the apocalypse, I went to see my family. I didn't try to convince them of anything. I had learned in my first life, slowly and painfully, and in this one, all at once, that you cannot make people believe things they are committed to not believing. Jason was hosting a live stream from his apartment. He had a refrigerator crammed with popsicles, 3 industrial fans positioned around the room, and a blue plastic kiddie pool on the balcony that he'd already filled with water. He had 11,000 viewers. They were enthusiastic. I watched for a few minutes through the window of my phone. He looked happy. He looked so certain and so happy, and I felt the thing I'd been carrying since I woke up on that sofa shift into something I didn't have a precise word for. Not pity, not contempt, something flatter and more final. I left the gift basket on my parents' doorstep. I'd filled it with things chosen carefully, with a kind of bitter love. Good sunscreen, SPF 70, the kind you'd want if heat was actually coming. 2 cooling towels, a 4-pack of electrolyte drinks, a handwritten note that said, "I hope you stay warm, I love you." Cassie, it was the truest thing I could give them and the only true thing they would accept from me right then. The cold came at 3:14 in the morning. I was awake. I'd been awake for an hour, watching the thermometer outside the penthouse window, waiting. The temperature had been dropping for 6 hours, slowly at first, 10 degrees over the first 2 hours, then faster, then terrifyingly fast. When I saw the outdoor reading hit -40, I woke Grandma Louise and Meyer, and we spent 20 minutes doing a final check of all the seals. By dawn, the streets were buried. The snow had come not in flakes, but in a kind of solid, horizontal wall, and then it had simply continued. By noon, the sky was a uniform pale gray that gave no indication of where the sun was. Cell service dropped at 7 a.m. The emergency radio offered 3 hours of broadcasts before the relay tower went silent. We were on our own. We were warm. The camping stove fit on the kitchen counter and ran beautifully on the propane we'd stored. Grandma Louise made soup the first night, proper soup, with real dried herbs she'd brought from her own kitchen. Maya sat cross-legged on the living room floor and taught us a card game I'd never heard of, something she said her grandmother had taught her, and we played it for 3 hours, and she won twice and pretended not to be pleased about it. On day 11, I made her turn 16. There was no cake mix in the freeze-dried supplies, but there were the components: flour, sugar, powdered egg, powdered milk. I had a small cast-iron pan and a camping stove and a great deal of goodwill. The result was a disc-shaped thing with a slight char on one side and a handful of dried cranberries pressed into the top, and when I brought it out with a birthday candle I'd found in a kitchen drawer, Maya looked at it for a long moment without speaking. "Happy birthday," I said. She blew out the candle and ate 2 pieces and then cried a little quietly, with her hands folded in her lap. Grandma Louise put an arm around her. I pretended to be very interested in washing the pan. I thought about my brother sometimes in those weeks. I thought about my parents. I didn't know when it happened, the moment they stopped being people I could save and became people I was simply surviving alongside at a distance. I didn't feel triumphant. I want to be clear about that. There was no satisfaction in being right. There was only the particular tiredness of a person who has been carrying a weight for a very long time and has finally been allowed to set it down. I was tired. I was warm. I was alive. On day 38, Grandma Louise found a crossword puzzle book in the stack of paperbacks. We did 2 puzzles a day after that, before dinner, with Maya reading out the clues and arguing cheerfully about the answers. On day 51, the snow stopped for 18 hours. We stood at the penthouse windows and watched the silence. The city was white and still. It looked like the surface of a different planet. On day 92, I was washing dishes when I heard it, a rhythmic thudding from somewhere above, mechanical and regular. Then a light. Then another light. I grabbed Maya's arm and we pressed our faces to the window, and there were the helicopters, 3 of them, moving in a line across the pale winter sky, with floodlights on their undersides sweeping the white rooftops. "They're here," Maya said. The rescue team was at the door 11 minutes later. A man in an orange thermal suit with a federal emergency logo on the arm knocked twice and announced himself through the door. I opened it with my hands shaking in a way I hadn't allowed them to shake for 3 months. 3 survivors, I told him. All okay. We have food left and propane to spare. He looked at me for a moment, at the 3 of us standing in our layered sweaters in the warm apartment, with the smell of soup coming from behind us and a card game spread across the coffee table, and something moved across his face that I couldn't quite read. "You were prepared," he said. "We were," I said. We walked out together into the pale winter sunlight, me and Grandma Louise and Maya, who was 16 years old and squinted up at the sky like someone seeing daylight for the first time. The snow was blue-white and blinding. The air was cold enough that every breath arrived with a small, private shock. I was exhausted. I was grateful. I had listened to the thing I knew was true, even when everyone I loved was absolutely certain I was wrong, and I had survived because of it. That was the whole of what I had. It was enough. Story 2, the supermarket queen's second chance. I have spent most of my adult life learning how to read what a room needs before anyone in it asks. This is not a spiritual skill. It is a retail skill. When you run a supermarket, even a small one, even a neighborhood one with hand-lettered signs and a broken freezer case in the back that only works if you hit it twice on the left side, you learn quickly that what people say they want and what they actually need are 2 different inventories, and that your job is to stock both. I woke up on a Thursday morning in October, 3 weeks before the end of the world, and the first thing I did was go to my supermarket. Not home. Not to the kitchen, where Frank's coffee was still in the pot from the morning he'd left 2 years ago, and I'd washed it out and moved on. Not to the bedroom, where the window latch had been broken since March. To the store, which opened at 7 and smelled like cardboard and floor wax and the particular sharp cleanness of refrigerated produce. I took inventory. In my previous life, I had died on day 41 of the freeze. Not from the cold directly, I want to be precise about this, but from the secondary effects: malnutrition, dehydration, a slow systemic failure that happens when a body has been surviving on minimum resources for too long in too cold temperatures. I had been in the wrong place. I had trusted the wrong people to have made provisions. I had believed, right up until I didn't, that things would be managed. This time, I managed them myself. The dream had come to me complete and detailed, the way important dreams sometimes do. The temperature readings on the outdoor thermometer, each one worse than the last. The empty shelves. The sound of wind through a broken window that no one could afford to repair because every resource had to go to staying warm. The date the blizzard had started, November 4th. The date it ended, April 9th. 186 days. I had 3 weeks. I used every hour of them. First, my daughter Nan Nan and my mother. I found a furnished apartment on the west side of Millbrook, a 2-bedroom on the 4th floor of a building with a recently upgraded heating system, brick construction, windows that faced south and west and would get whatever winter sun there was. I paid 3 months upfront in cash and carried in our things in 2 trips. My mother asked no questions. She was the kind of woman who understood urgency without requiring an explanation for it. Nan Nan, who was 7 and constitutionally adaptable, asked only if she could bring her stuffed rabbit and her colored pencils. I said yes to both. Over the following 2 weeks, I filled every available space in that apartment. Canned food organized by type and caloric density. Propane canisters for the camp stove. Sealed containers of rice, dried beans, oats. A medical kit that went beyond the standard and included prescription medications I obtained with a visit to a cooperative doctor who agreed that yes, it was reasonable to have a month's supply on hand. Thermal sleeping bags, wool blankets, a hand-cranked radio. Enough bottled water to last 3 months, supplemented by the collapsible containers I filled and stacked in the bathtub. I did all of this while continuing to run the supermarket. The supermarket was, in fact, where most of it came from. I paid for it properly through the business accounts, and I noted the inventory reduction accurately in the books, because I intended to survive the apocalypse and then have a functioning business afterward, and that required clean records. Frank came back on a Wednesday. I knew he was coming because his mother, Loretta, had called me the week before. Loretta never called unless something was happening that she wanted credit for managing. She'd called to inform me, in her particular tone of generous condescension, that Frank was wrapping up his overseas assignment and coming home, and that she hoped we could all move forward as a family. I had thanked her for letting me know and ended the call and felt almost nothing, which told me everything I needed to know about how thoroughly I'd already let go. Frank came back with Serena, who was 4 months pregnant and looked as though she'd been bracing herself for weeks. She was not what I expected. She was small and anxious-looking, not predatory, and I registered this only as data. It didn't change anything. Frank had made choices, and now he was home with the results of those choices, and I had made choices too, and mine were in a furnished apartment on the west side with my daughter and my mother and a 2-month supply of canned soup. I watched it unfold on the camera I'd installed before I left. A small thing, wireless, positioned to show the living room and kitchen. I told myself I'd installed it for security purposes. This was partly true. Loretta was magnificent in her awfulness. She filmed everything. She posted constant updates. Frank and Serena at the kitchen table, so bless this family is growing. Serena opening the refrigerator I'd stocked for years, making a home, the nursery that used to be the spare room. Life is beautiful. She had 47,000 followers by the time the blizzard hit. She'd gained most of them in the last 2 weeks. I sent her a text message on the Sunday before it started. "Mom, I'm not coming back. Here's $10,000. All I ask is that you tell me he came home." She responded 20 minutes later, received, "Frank is home. I appreciate your understanding." She never mentioned it again. I caught Frank following me on the Tuesday morning 2 days before the blizzard. I had been leaving the supermarket after closing, and I saw his car 2 blocks back, keeping pace. I had anticipated this. I drove directly to the Millbrook police station, parked in the lot, and walked inside. Frank pulled up 3 minutes later, saw where he was, and drove away. I filed a report anyway. When he called me that night, I didn't answer. When he appeared at the supermarket the next morning, I called the non-emergency line and he was asked to leave. He was not detained, he'd done nothing technically actionable. But the officer who asked him to move along was thorough about it, and Frank left looking embarrassed, and I felt something release in my chest that I hadn't realized was still clenched. The blizzard began at 11:40 p.m. on November 4th. I know because I was awake, watching the weather data on my laptop when the outdoor temperature sensor dropped below 0. By 2 a.m. it was -40 Fahrenheit. By noon the following day, it was -100. Loretta filmed it. "This is what I will always remember." She filmed it. She filmed herself wrapped in a quilt on the sofa, staying cozy, "Stay warm out there." And she filmed the snow driving sideways past the window, and she filmed the refrigerator, which was still full of perishables because no one in that apartment had apparently considered that perishables were not ideal emergency provisions. And she filmed herself trying to reach the furnace repair line and getting a busy signal, and she posted all of it and the views climbed. 40,000, 80,000, 200,000, because human beings are drawn to watching other human beings in crisis. And then, on day 3, someone recognized the building from the background of one of her videos. I watched it happen in a way I had not anticipated and could not have planned for. A comment thread, the building address crowdsourced from the street view behind the window, and then a small group of desperate and freezing people who had seen, on camera, a refrigerator full of food. I was in the safe apartment with my daughter when I saw the notification on my phone. Nan was drawing at the kitchen table, working on a very serious picture of a horse. My mother was reading. There was soup on the stove, actual soup, real soup, with carrots and potatoes and a thyme sprig from the little container herb garden I'd thought to bring along. The apartment was warm. The curtains were drawn. I watched the camera feed on my phone for 11 minutes, and then I put the phone face down on the counter and asked Nan to tell me about the horse. She told me about the horse. It was a brown horse with a white mark on its nose, and it was running through a field, and its name was Biscuit. She spent a long time on the mane. I looked at her, and I thought about all the ways a life can pivot on a single decision. The decision to check one more thing, to prepare one more week, to choose the person sitting in front of you over the person who gave you a ring. Day 186 was a Sunday. The blizzard ended not dramatically but incrementally, the way blizzards actually end. The wind dropped, the snow thinned, the temperature climbed in small grudging increments over 3 days until it was merely brutally cold rather than terminally so. I heard the relief trucks before I saw them, the low rumble of heavy vehicles on a street that had been silent for months, and then the squawk of a loudspeaker, and then Nan running to the window. We went outside together, the three of us. My mother, me, Nan, who had grown 2 inches since October and whose voice had gotten slightly lower in a way I hadn't noticed until I heard her say mama in the new cold air. The air smelled like wet snow and diesel and something else underneath, something I couldn't name, the smell of things beginning to thaw, maybe. The smell of a world that intended to continue. A letter arrived from Frank's lawyer 11 days later, sent through the building manager since Frank apparently didn't have my forwarding address. It cited his entitlement to portions of several assets, including the furnished apartment I was currently living in, on the grounds that it had been purchased with marital funds. The letter was 3 pages, single-spaced, in a font that was trying very hard to be intimidating. I had it framed, not as a joke, as a document. I hung it in the apartment entryway, between a photo of Nan's first day of school and the framed health certificate from the supermarket's last inspection. People who came to visit occasionally asked about it. I told them it was a reminder that preparation is the only argument that matters. That before any tribunal, before any negotiation, before any conversation about what you deserve and what someone else claims, before all of that, you need to have made sure your daughter is warm. I never wrote back. Story 3, stranded at the station, the worst part was the crying girl. I'd been standing in the ticket line for 4 hours on the morning of February 8, 2042, and the line had barely moved, and I was thinking about my feet and my phone battery and the particular specific misery of being cold in a crowd, when I noticed the little girl standing by the pillar near the south entrance. She was maybe 5 years old, in a red coat with a hood that kept slipping off, and she was crying the kind of cry that a child cries when they've been crying for long enough that they've lost track of why they started, just a continuous, bewildered grief, small and steady, and completely unnoticed by anyone around her. I watched her for 30 seconds, thinking someone would come for her. Nobody came. I was about to step out of the line when a woman hurried out of a side corridor and swept the girl up. The mother, clearly, they had the same round face and the same way of holding their mouths, and I stepped back into my place and thought, okay, she's fine. I should have paid attention to the image. The crying girl, the red coat. The fact that this moment was so specific and small and normal, the way things are normal right up until they stop being normal at all. I had been traveling home for New Year. My apartment was across town, a 40-minute train ride, but the trains were backed up and the booking system had crashed twice that morning, and I was doing what everyone in that station was doing. Waiting, shifting weight from foot to foot, watching the departures board with the focused attention of a person who has decided that if they look hard enough the board will change. The temperature was already wrong. I know this now with the authority of someone who came back knowing what to look for, but I have to be honest. In the moment, I felt it without fully processing it. It was February, so cold was expected, but this was a different kind of cold. Not the ambient, seasonal cold that a body adjusts to over weeks, but an aggressive cold, a moving cold, the kind that finds gaps and enters them. I'd been inside the station for 3 hours, and I was still cold in a way that the interior heating should have addressed. The crowd started to feel different around 11 a.m. Not panicked, not yet, but compressed, the way a crowd feels when it realizes it is larger than the space it's in. People stopped looking at phones and started looking at each other. The departures board went dark for 20 seconds, and when it came back, 7 trains had been canceled. The stampede started near the east platform entrance. I will not describe it in detail, because some things don't need to be detailed to be understood. I was at the back of the crowd nearest the main hall when it began, which is why I survived it. I had room to be pushed sideways rather than down. I lost my carry-on bag. I caught someone's elbow in the ribs hard enough that I couldn't fully expand my right lung for the next 2 hours. I got out through a service corridor that I forced open with the fire axe. No, wait. I didn't have the axe yet. I got out through a service corridor by following a transit worker who moved with the efficiency of a man who'd been through this before and knew which doors were unlocked. Outside the station, the air hit me like a physical object. It was 11:24 a.m., and the temperature had dropped 30 degrees since morning. My phone was at 2%. I had exactly enough battery to do one thing. I opened the rideshare app and booked the first available driver, a Mercedes minivan, a man named Terrence who was 3 blocks away, and I did not move from the spot until I saw the van. Terrence was a large, steady-natured man who had apparently decided that the way to handle the day was to simply proceed with his schedule and let the world arrange itself around him. He asked where I was going. I told him my apartment address, and then I said, "Can we stop first? There's an outdoor supply store on West Calver Street. That's 12 minutes out of the way. I'll pay for the detour." He looked at me in the rearview mirror. Something in my face must have communicated that I was not being whimsical. He turned left. On the drive, I watched the temperature readout on my phone. I'd pulled up the weather app in the last seconds of battery before I got into the van. In the 40 minutes since I'd left the station, the temperature had dropped another 15 degrees. I did the math in the back of the minivan, with the kind of clarity that comes when your body has already decided that panic is not a productive option. And so your mind goes very quiet and very fast. 30 degrees every 2 hours. Where it was going to end up was not survivable outdoors. The question was how long it would take to get there. "I need to ask you something," I said to Terrence, "and I need you to hear me out before you say anything." He said nothing, which I took as permission. I told him about the temperature curve. I told him what I thought was coming. I told him that I was going to the outdoor supply store to buy everything I could carry that would keep a person alive in extreme cold, and that I thought he should do the same, not as a matter of insurance, but as a matter of immediate necessity. Terrence listened to all of this and then said, "How cold are we talking?" -80 Celsius before it peaks. A pause. That's not. I know how it sounds. He pulled into the parking lot of the outdoor supply store on West Calver. He didn't turn off the engine. He sat for a moment with his hands on the wheel, and then he said, "I'll wait here." I went inside. I bought 2 four-season expedition tents. I bought 4 sleeping bags rated to -40 Fahrenheit, which was not enough, but was better than nothing. I bought a camp stove and 6 propane canisters. I bought a fire axe from the tool section. I bought 4 20-pound bags of freeze-dried food and every energy bar on the shelf. I bought silicone sealant, a box of adhesive weather strip tape, and 3 rolls of foam insulation. I bought a hand-cranked radio. The total came to $1,142. I paid with the emergency credit card I kept in my coat lining and had never used. The cashier looked at the pile. She looked at me. She looked outside at the parking lot where the trees were doing something strange in the wind, bending in a direction that the wind shouldn't have been coming from. "Storm?" she said. "Yes," I said. I carried everything out in 3 trips. Terrence helped me load the back of the van without comment. When we were done, I turned to him and said, "Please go home and stay inside. Seal your windows, don't go out." He looked at me for a long moment. "My sister lives 3 miles from here," he said. "Call her first, then go to her or bring her to you. Don't be alone." I cried a little in the back of the van on the way to my apartment. Not loudly, not in a way that required addressing, just the specific kind of crying that happens when you've done everything you can do and you know it isn't enough for everyone, and that the people you couldn't reach are already beyond reaching. Terrence didn't comment on it. He pulled up to my building and helped me carry things to the elevator without being asked, and when I thanked him he said, "Stay warm," and then he was gone. My apartment was on the 9th floor of a 14-story building on Clement Avenue. I'd lived there for 3 years. I knew every quirk of it. The draft from the hallway door, the window on the east wall that sat slightly crooked in its frame and let in a thread of cold air when the wind was in the right direction, the fact that the heating vent in the living room floor was the most efficient one in the apartment. I knew all of this the way you know a place you've inhabited carefully. I spent 6 hours sealing every gap. Silicone sealant around every window frame, every door edge, every baseboard crack. Foam insulation panels cut to size and pressed into the window openings, taped in place. The tent, this was my best idea, and I was quietly proud of it, pitched directly over the floor heating vent in the living room. the sleeping bags laid out inside it, creating a pocket of air that could be maintained at a survivable temperature even if the building's heating system faltered. I had just finished sealing the east bedroom window when the power went out for the first time. It came back 6 minutes later, but the message was clear. On day 2, the volunteer auntie knocked. She was a woman in her 60s, built like someone who had been solving problems with her hands for decades, with a community emergency kit on her belt and a yellow reflective vest over 3 layers of clothing. She explained that she was coordinating the building's emergency response, distributing supplies, checking on residents, and that she needed help clearing snow from the building's emergency exits, which had drifted over. In exchange, she could offer a liter of cooking oil and a dozen eggs. I went. I should not have gone. In retrospect, I know this. At the time, the egg seemed significant. It was -52°C outside. I know this because the thermometer mounted on the outside of the second-floor fire door read it in bright orange digital numbers as I went out. We had 38 minutes before the cold became medically catastrophic without proper protection. I had pulled on every layer I owned plus the sleeping bag liners I'd attached to the inside of my coat with safety pins. I lasted 23 minutes before volunteer auntie, who was significantly hardier than me and considerably more adapted to outdoor work, sent me back inside. I made it to the elevator shaking hard enough that I dropped my key twice. I sat inside my apartment for an hour with a camp stove mug of hot water and waited for my core temperature to come back up. That evening, 302 arrived. His real name, I later learned, was not important. He had introduced himself to the building in the first days of the blizzard as the new apartment captain, the person responsible for coordinating building-level emergency response, tracking who had supplies and who needed them, maintaining a roster of residents. He carried a clipboard. He wore a high-visibility vest that was almost identical to the volunteer auntie's. He was polite, measured, and thorough. He took notes while he spoke to you. He nodded when you answered. He thanked you for your time and reminded you to conserve heat and stay off the stairs after 9 p.m. I felt uneasy when he knocked on my door. I felt uneasy in a way that I couldn't immediately articulate, not something he said, not anything specific in his manner, but a quality in the attention he gave, a quality I can only describe as inventory. He was looking at what I had, not casually, not as a byproduct of the conversation, as a primary activity. I answered his questions through the cracked door and told him I had minimal supplies and was managing fine, thank you, and that I hadn't seen anything unusual on the floor. He thanked me and moved on. I watched through the peephole until he disappeared around the corner of the hallway. 3 days later, at 4 a.m., I heard a door open. My unit was near the end of the hall, across from the elevator, a position that meant I got more hallway sound than the middle units. I lay still in the tent in my sleeping bag and listened. Footsteps, slow and deliberate. A knock, very quiet, 2 doors down, that was 903, where Mrs. Lee lived with her husband. A pause, the sound of a door opening, the sound of nothing for a very long time. Then the sound of a door not closing. I know what cold air sounds like when it enters a building corridor from an open apartment. I know it because I'd been living in silence for days by then, and silence makes you attentive in a way that ordinary life never does. I heard the temperature change in the hallway through my own door, the faint sound of the corridor's ambient warmth being replaced with something much older and deeper and colder. Mrs. Lee's door was open. In -80°C weather. It had been open for, I checked my watch, 40 minutes. I picked up the fire axe. I want to be clear about what I was feeling. Not heroism, not bravery, nothing with a name that sounds good in retrospect. I was afraid. I was so afraid that my hands were moving mechanically, without instruction from whatever part of my brain handles deliberate decisions. I wrapped myself in everything I owned, coat, sleeping bag liner as a shawl, doubled wool socks, and I unlatched my own door and went into the corridor. Mrs. Lee's door was standing open by about 14 inches. The cold that came through it was absolute. I found them in the back bedroom. I will not describe it beyond saying, Mrs. Lee and her husband, both gone, with the particular evidence of force that no cold could explain. They'd been gone for hours. I was still standing there when I heard footsteps in the corridor. I moved faster than I'd moved in years. Back to the front room, axe raised, breath held. The footsteps stopped outside the door. A shadow moved across the gap of light under the door's lower edge. Then, a knock. 2 knocks, quiet, the exact cadence I'd heard at 4 a.m. I stood absolutely still. My lungs stopped. The shadow under the door didn't move. 5 minutes. I counted the seconds. At 300, the shadow moved away. I made it back to my own unit and chained the door. I spent the next 18 hours preparing. I boiled a full pot of water on the camp stove and kept it at temperature. I moved the fire axe to within arm's reach of the door. I pushed the wardrobe against the hallway wall and slept facing the door. When 302 knocked the second time, it was morning. He was polite. He said he was checking on residents on the floor and wanted to confirm I was managing all right. I said yes, through the door, in a voice I made deliberately thin and tired. I said I was running low on propane and wasn't doing well. I heard him start to say something further, and I opened the door to the width of the chain and threw the boiling water through the gap. The sound he made is something I will carry for the rest of my life. He fell backward. He hit the far wall of the corridor. He did not, as I had briefly been afraid, get up immediately. He screamed and then he scrambled, and I heard him go down the stairwell and then silence. I chained the door. I sat down on the floor with my back against the wall and my knees up, and I breathed. Police arrived on day 22, a specialized cold-weather emergency unit in full thermal gear, moving floor by floor. When they knocked on my door and announced themselves, I verified through the peephole for 40 seconds before I opened the chain. 302 had been arrested at a warming shelter 6 miles away with burns on his face and hands. He had killed, they told me, 7 residents in the building over the course of the blizzard, systematically, beginning on day 3. He had murdered the actual building captain, a retired teacher named Mr. Gaines who had lived in Unit 302, on the first night and taken his identification and his clipboard and his vest. Every resident I might have turned to for help had been his first targets. I was the only surviving resident on floors 7 through 10. When the snow finally melted, weeks later, the specific date doesn't matter. What matters is the morning. I bought flowers from the first shop I found open and took the train to the cemetery where Mrs. Lee had been buried by the city. I found the grave by the temporary marker, the kind with a laminated card in a plastic sleeve, and I put the flowers down and stood there for a while in the thin spring sunlight. A man came and stood beside me after a moment, her son, it turned out. A man in his 40s with tired eyes who introduced himself quietly and thanked me for what I'd done. I couldn't save her, I said. You documented it, he said. You were a witness, that matters. He had a daughter, he said. She'd been with him during the blizzard, safe at his house in the suburbs. She was 6 now. She'd been at the train station with her mother on the morning of February 8th, crying by the south entrance pillar, and a woman had looked at her, just looked, for 30 seconds, making sure she was all right before the crowd shifted and swallowed everyone. I stood at Mrs. Lee's grave and let the sunlight do what sunlight does. Thank you, I said to her, to the ground, to whoever was listening, for letting me be the one who lived. Story 4. The fake gentleman's last winter Victor was playing a game. This is how I always knew where I was in the house. I could track him by sound, the specific digital percussion of keys, and the low, steady drone of headset audio, the occasional burst of voice chat that he muted before I could hear the words. He'd been at it since 10 in the morning. It was now 2 in the afternoon, and he hadn't moved except to get another energy drink from the kitchen, and the can was sitting on the edge of my coffee table, the one I'd chosen and paid for and carried up 3 flights of stairs with my own 2 hands, without a coaster. I was sitting in the armchair across from him, and I was not in 2026 at all. I was somewhere further back, standing in a cold I had already lived through once, and I was remembering the exact texture of a particular night. The way my own coat had felt in Sylvia's hands when she'd taken it from my shoulders, the sound of Victor's voice when he told me the balcony needed shoveling and handed me a snow brush. The way the balcony door had clicked shut behind me. The way it had locked. I had died on that balcony on day 17 of the freeze, with negative 40 Celsius air filling my lungs and the glass door between me and the living room where Victor and Sylvia sat beside the burning furniture, warm. I was alive now. I was in the armchair. Victor was pressing buttons. The energy drink was still on my coffee table, still without a coaster. I stood up and I went to the kitchen and I made myself coffee, strong, in the good mug. And I stood at the kitchen window and looked out at the street, and I gave myself exactly 10 minutes to understand what I was going to do. 29 days. I had the advantage of knowing what was coming and when it would come, and I had the further advantage of knowing exactly who I was dealing with. When Sylvia arrived at 6 for dinner, I was ready. She came in already narrating the traffic, the neighbor's dog, the quality of the produce at the market, and dropped her coat on the hook and turned to me with the particular expression she wore when she was about to identify something that needed improving. I had the envelope in my pocket. "Mom," I said, which is how I had always addressed her, "I have to go back to the factory tonight. Something's come up with the machines. You and Victor should go out. I've left some cash." I held out the envelope. She took it before she looked inside. The counting happened quickly, practiced, and when she looked up there was a new calculation behind her eyes. $10,000 has a way of restructuring conversations. "Of course," she said. "Of course, the factory comes first. Victor, come say goodbye to your wife." Victor came out of the bedroom with his headset around his neck and his eyes still focused on a screen that was no longer in front of him. He looked at the envelope in his mother's hand. He looked at me. "Where are you going?" he said. "Factory emergency," I said. "I'll call when I can." I left before he could think of an objection. I had been planning for 2 weeks, quietly, systematically, the way I used to plan the factory's production calendar, with attention to sequence and resource allocation, and the specific bottlenecks that could delay everything if you weren't careful. The factory I'd inherited from my parents was the cornerstone of the whole problem. Victor had spent 3 years trying to get his name onto the ownership documents, and his mother had spent the same 3 years reinforcing his ambition with her own. And neither of them had ever quite managed it, because the factory's attorney was a precise and unsentimental woman named Petra who had structured the inheritance with the particular care of someone who'd watched families tear themselves apart over assets. I called Petra first. Then I called a commercial real estate broker named Davis who had once expressed interest in the factory's property lease. Then I called the bank. The sequence took 6 days. I leased the factory, the property, not the business operations, through Davis at a rate that covered my costs. I took an emergency business loan against the equipment inventory, collateral only, no personal guarantee. With the combined cash position, I rented the villa. It was on the southwest edge of town in a neighborhood that had been half-built and then paused during a market correction several years earlier, which meant the streets were wide and the houses were set well apart, and there were exactly 3 occupied properties on the block. The villa had been vacant for 18 months. It smelled like dry concrete and dust, but the bones were sound. Thick masonry construction, double-pane windows, a heating system that had never been used. And in the basement, a full below-grade basement, accessible by an interior staircase from the kitchen, there were 12-foot ceilings and poured concrete walls, and mounted in the corner, an antique wood-burning stove that had been left behind by the previous owners and that I intended to use. I spent 10 days filling that basement. I moved supplies in the evenings, always from different stores, always in quantities that looked reasonable for a small business owner who was simply being prudent. Canned goods by the case, dried staples, rice, lentils, oats, in sealed 5-gallon buckets, medical supplies beyond what I'd ever needed in my previous life. Winter clothing in multiple sizes, because I had the space and the money and the knowledge that clothing is the first thing people lose track of in a survival situation. A wood-burning stove that I'd already tested with 2 separate fires to confirm the chimney drafted properly. Firewood, cord after cord, split and stacked against the basement's south wall until the stack was chest-high and 12 feet long. A generator and fuel. I installed cameras on the exterior of the property and on the fence gate, and I installed cameras pointing at the block faces in either direction. I had, in my previous life, always underestimated the importance of knowing what was coming before it arrived. I was not going to make that mistake again. The divorce conversation happened on a Wednesday, 9 days before the freeze. I put the papers on the kitchen table while Victor was eating breakfast, and I stood across from him, and I said what I had planned to say, without preamble and without emotion, because I had learned that emotion gave him material to work with and I had no material to spare. "I want a divorce," I said. "I'm giving you the apartment. I want my freedom and nothing else." He looked at the papers. He looked at me. His face went through several expressions in quick succession: surprise, calculation, offense, and then settled on the one he usually reached for when he wanted to appear wronged. "This isn't," he started. "You have 3 days to sign," I said. "After 3 days, I file with a lawyer and it becomes public record and it takes 6 months. This way is clean. I'm giving you the apartment outright. The contents, everything in it." He didn't sign in 3 days. On the 4th day, I called Petra and she filed. He found the hotel I was staying at by following the credit card, a mistake I'd anticipated. He stood outside my room door at 11 p.m. and then knocked again, and then said my name through the door in a low voice that was trying to sound reasonable and was not succeeding. I called the police non-emergency line, and he was asked to leave the premises. He was not arrested. He had not technically done anything arrestable, but the hotel had a security record of the incident, and the responding officer had his information. And when I showed up at the station the next morning to add a formal statement, the officer on duty was attentive in a way that suggested this was a pattern she had seen before. Victor signed the papers that afternoon. Sylvia called me 17 times. I let them go to voicemail. I left for the villa on a Saturday morning with my winter gear in 2 duffel bags and the key in my coat pocket. I did not look at the apartment as I left. There was nothing in it worth the look. The freeze began at 3 a.m. on a Tuesday, 3 days after I moved in. I was asleep in the basement beside the wood stove when the temperature sensor on my phone app dropped 40 degrees in 2 hours. I was awake before the 3rd alert and had the fire built up before the 4th. By dawn, it was minus 60 Celsius outside. By the following night, it was minus 70. The world outside the villa was silent in a way that has no peacetime analog, a silence that isn't the absence of sound but the presence of something that has replaced it. I had a novel. I had food and water and fire and time. I read. I cooked proper meals on the wood stove, the kind that take an hour and fill the basement with warmth and the smell of onions and herbs. I did exercises in the morning, a routine I invented for the space, working within the constraints of the room, which turned out to be a useful meditation on what the body can accomplish in 12 square feet. I kept a journal, not for emotional reasons, but because structure was important and the journal provided it. What I ate, how much fuel I'd used, what the temperature was, what I had done. I watched the cameras. Victor and Sylvia had moved into the apartment block 3 miles away. I'd expected this. It was the obvious move, since the apartment had better heating infrastructure than the old place. I watched them on the cameras I'd positioned on the block face. On day 4, a man I recognized appeared. The building boss, a corpulent man who had positioned himself during the first days of the freeze as the essential community organizer, distributing supplies from a common stockpile that he had, it became clear over subsequent days, largely assembled by taking them from other residents. He had 2 men with him who carried lengths of pipe. I watched this the way you watch weather. With attention, without surprise, noting data. The building boss knew about the factory. Victor had told him. I could track the information spreading through the network of people I was watching, piecing it together from behaviors that cameras could read even without audio. By day 11, Victor had apparently communicated to the building boss that I had resources, and the building boss had made the obvious calculation, and Victor had made the transaction that this calculation required. They came at night. I was upstairs in the villa's 2nd floor. I'd been using it as a lookout, positioning myself at the window after dark with the lights off to watch the street in both directions. I saw them when they were still a block away, 5 figures in the dark, moving in the particular careful way that people move when they don't want to be seen and are not accustomed to the cold. Victor in front, identifiable by his walk. The building boss in the center, broader than the others. 2 men behind carrying equipment I couldn't identify from that distance, and a 5th figure, smaller, moving reluctantly, that I recognized as Zara. I went downstairs. I filled 3 large stock pots with water and put them on the wood stove at maximum heat and watched them until they were at a full rolling boil. I carried them upstairs 2 at a time, setting them beside the window that overlooked the front gate. I put on my heaviest gloves, the kind with the grip palms, and I waited. When they reached the fence, Victor's voice came through the cold air with perfect clarity, the way sound carries in extreme cold. "Chloe, we know you're in there. Open the gate. It's freezing, Chloe, open the gate." The building boss said something in a lower voice. One of the men moved toward the gate's hinge side. I opened the window. The water was, at that point, still very close to boiling, not boiling precisely, but at the temperature of something that causes irreversible damage to whatever it contacts. I tilted the first pot through the iron fence grate at an angle that spread the distribution across the width of the group. At negative 70 Celsius, water doesn't splash and cool. It contacts, transfers its heat, and in the same moment the cold takes that heat and what remains is not water anymore. Victor's voice stopped with a specificity that was not like other sounds stopping. The building boss made a different sound, lower and more continuous. I watched from the window until the silence below had the quality of permanence. Then I went downstairs and stood by the wood stove for a long time, my hands held out toward the heat. On day 39, a radio signal came through my emergency receiver. Not a broadcast, a directed signal, narrowband, someone calling on a specific frequency that required them to know I was on it. I had shared the frequency, weeks before the freeze, with a woman who lived in Unit 101 of my old building, a pharmacist named Ellen who'd asked me quietly one afternoon if I thought the weather was going to get worse and had listened when I said yes. Ellen had made it. She had supplies, more than she'd expected to need, because she'd started earlier than most. We traded information over the radio that evening. Weather patterns, what she'd observed from her building's roof, what I'd observed from my cameras. We talked about what we'd read recently. We talked about what we planned to cook the following week. She had a good sense of humor that came through even over the static. We talked every day after that. It was, I realized, the first voluntary conversation I'd had in years that felt like a conversation and not a negotiation. Day 186. The rescue teams came in with heavy trucks and thermal gear and the specific competent urgency of people who have been doing a job for a long time and have been allowed to do it properly. I heard them before I saw them, the engine sounds, and then the loudspeaker, and then the knock at the villa gate with the particular rhythm of official announcement. I went out through the front door carrying a thermos of coffee. I had, against all reasonable expectation, run out of almost nothing, having stocked for 240 days, and a paperback novel I'd been rereading for the third time. The air outside was, for the first time in 6 months, merely very cold rather than terminally cold. It tasted like winter. It tasted like the specific clarity that comes after a long duration of something has ended. The rescue team leader was a woman in her 40s who looked at me with the careful assessment of a professional and then said, "You're the sole resident of this property?" "Yes," I said. "How long have you been here?" "Since the beginning." She wrote something on her clipboard. "Do you have medical needs?" "No." I unscrewed the thermos. "Would you like coffee?" She took the coffee. We stood outside the villa in the thin winter sun, and I did not look back at the house. I did not look toward the old apartment block. I looked at the rescue team's vehicles, at the cleared strip of road behind them, at the sky which was performing, for the first time in a very long time, the ordinary miracle of being blue. I had come out. I had survived. I had not needed to be cruel. The weather had administered what cruelty required, with an impartiality that no human court could match. I had prepared. I had chosen the right walls, the right fuel, the right depths underground. I had chosen myself, finally, which was the decision I should have made years before a single flake of apocalypse snow had fallen, and I had done it in time. That was enough. It was, in fact, more than enough. I drank my coffee in the winter sun, and I did not look back. Story 5. The friend who stayed. The TV was on when I came back. That's the thing I remember most clearly, not the gasp of air, not the shock of consciousness slamming back into my body like a fist through thin ice. It was the TV. A weather anchor in a yellow blazer was cheerfully explaining that June had set a new record high, that Phoenix was projecting triple digits through the end of the month, that everyone should stay hydrated and enjoy the heat while it lasted. I sat on my couch and watched her smile and felt something cold settle deep in my chest. I knew what came after the heat. I was in my apartment. My apartment, not a snowdrift outside a locked door, not -80 degrees cutting through a borrowed coat that wasn't warm enough to matter. My apartment, with its second-hand furniture, and the string lights above the kitchen window, and the smell of the lavender candle I'd burned down to a stub 2 days ago. I was alive. I was a week early. I pressed my palm flat against my sternum and breathed. Then I picked up my phone and called Max. He answered on the second ring the way he always did. "Hey, everything okay?" "I need your help," I said. "No questions yet. Can you come over?" A pause, not a hesitant one, just the sound of him already standing up. "Give me 20 minutes. That's the thing about Max. He'd been my best friend since sophomore year of college. When we ended up as lab partners in an environmental science class neither of us wanted to take. He had no family, he'd aged out of foster care at 18, and built his entire life from scratch with nothing but stubbornness and a very particular kind of quiet loyalty. In my first life, I hadn't called him at the end. I'd thought I could handle it myself. I'd trusted my mother instead. I wasn't going to make that mistake again. He showed up with a paper bag of Thai takeout because he'd been on his way to pick up dinner anyway, and he sat down across from me at the kitchen table and set out the containers without being asked. We ate, and then I told him everything. I told him about the cold front that would arrive in 7 days, not a normal cold snap, not a polar vortex the news could put a tidy graphic on, but a genuine civilizational collapse of temperature, the kind that dropped 85 degrees in 5 hours and kept dropping. I told him about -80 Celsius. I told him about the months it would last. I told him about my mother and Rosa and Wyatt, about the stockpile I'd spent 2 years building in my first life, about the moment I understood that my own mother had handed my house key to a violent man in exchange for her own safety. I told him how I died. Max didn't interrupt. He sat with his hands wrapped around a container of Pad CU and listened to every word. When I finished, the food was cold and the string lights above the kitchen window were the only light in the room. He said, "Okay, where do we start?" I almost cried. I didn't because there wasn't time, but I almost did. "We need a property," I said. "Something insulated, natural heat source if we can find it, away from the city center." He pulled out his laptop before I'd finished the sentence. It took him less than an hour. He'd been scrolling through estate listings, foreclosures, unusual property sales, the kind of research Max could do faster than anyone I knew because he'd had to learn early how to find resources in places others overlooked. He turned the screen toward me. It was a listing for a villa in the foothills northeast of the city. Stone construction, built in the 1940s, renovated twice. The listing noted a natural geothermal spring in the basement. The asking price had been dropped 30% because of how it came to market. The previous owners, a retired couple, had posted their location publicly online during an earlier cold emergency 2 winters back, hoping someone would come help them. No one had. The listing agent noted the property had been vacant since. I read the obituary Max had found alongside it. I didn't linger on it. "The hot spring," I said. "Constant heat source, stone walls. That fireplace in the living room is original. It's a real working chimney, not decorative." He pointed to the listing photos. "And it's elevated. Any flooding from snowmelt won't reach it. How fast can we close?" "Cash offer, waive inspection. The estate's been sitting on this for 4 months. I think we could close in 3 days." We split the cost. Max had savings he'd been sitting on for years, waiting for something worth spending them on. I had my own. Together we made the offer the next morning, and by Thursday afternoon we were standing in the villa with a ring of keys and a list. We had 4 days. We worked like we were being timed because we were. Max drove the truck while I organized. We bought in bulk, the kind of buying that gets you looks at Costco, multiple carts, multiple trips. Freeze-dried meals, rice and dried beans in sealed buckets. Cases of canned tomatoes, chickpeas, tuna, soup. Propane canisters, a second generator. Medical supplies, antibiotics we could get over the counter across the state line, bandage supplies, a blood pressure cuff, a pulse oximeter, vitamin D because we'd need it. Wool blankets, thermal underlayers, water filtration. Firewood, we ordered 2 cords delivered and stacked them ourselves against the south wall of the villa where the overhang would keep them dry. On the 3rd day, while Max was running a supply run, Rosa called. I looked at her name on the screen for a moment before I answered. "Hey," she said, and her voice had that particular texture it got when she wanted something slightly warm, slightly stretched. "I've been trying to reach you. Mom's been having some health issues. She might need surgery. The estimate is pretty significant and you know how her insurance is." "Send me the paperwork," I said. A short pause. "What paperwork?" "The doctor's estimate, the diagnosis, the insurance denial letter, whatever you have." Another pause, longer. "I don't have all of that on hand right now. I just need to know if you can help, Lily. Family helps family." I listened to her say that and thought about my house key. I thought about my mother watching me be thrown out into the cold and deciding that her own comfort was worth more than my life. I thought about Rosa calling my stockpile, our supplies, the moment she decided I wasn't necessary anymore. "I'll wire you something," I said, cheerfully. The same bright tone she used on me. "I'll send it tonight." "Oh, okay, great. Thank you, Lily, really?" "One more thing," I said. "I heard Wyatt might be having some trouble with his lease. I think the management company at his building has been having inspections. You might want to tell him to check his mailbox." I'd already passed the tip through a channel Max had helped me set up, nothing traceable. Just an anonymous complaint filed through the city's housing portal about the address Wyatt had, listed on a loan application he'd never bothered to close out. It was enough to flag a compliance review, nothing dramatic, just inconvenient and timed well. I did send Rosa the money. A small amount, enough to look like I'd tried. The loan in Wyatt's name was a quieter piece of work. Max had a contact, someone who operated in the gray space of financial systems, the kind of person you didn't ask too many questions about, and between them they'd structured a short-term credit line using Wyatt's information, which Wyatt had previously left exposed when he'd used my laptop without my permission and accessed his own banking portal. I hadn't planned to use it. In this life, I did. The money went directly into the villa's renovation fund, covered the wood stove installation and the basement waterproofing around the hot spring. I didn't feel bad about it. He'd taken a great deal more from me in another life and hadn't felt bad at all. The cold came on a Tuesday. It came the way I knew it would, first, a strangeness in the air, something the weather apps couldn't quite explain, a front that didn't behave like fronts were supposed to. By noon, the temperature had dropped 30 degrees. By 3 in the afternoon, it was below freezing. By the time the evening news anchors had stopped sounding calm, Max and I were sitting in front of the stone fireplace in the villa with a hot pot bubbling between us on the coffee table, the foothills dark outside the tall windows, snow beginning to fall in thick, deliberate curtains. Max dropped a slice of beef into the broth. "You think they're okay?" "I think they're realizing they're not," I said. We ate quietly. The fire was loud. The hot spring in the basement kept the floor warm even in the far rooms, a low, radiant heat that came up through the stone. I'd set a thermometer outside before it got dark. By morning, it read -22 Fahrenheit and dropping. On day 3, I called my mother on video. She picked up fast, which told me the power in the apartment building was still on. They were on a grid that had backup generation. Her face on the screen looked tight. "Lily, where are you? Are you safe?" I turned the camera slowly. I showed her the fireplace. I showed her the full shelves of food along the east wall. I tilted the phone so she could see the steam rising from the hot spring access room at the back of the hall. "I'm doing fine, Mom," I said. "Really fine." She stared at the screen for a long moment. I watched her face move through something surprise, then a calculating look I recognized, then something that might have been the beginning of a request. "Lily, if there's room?" "I have to go," I said. "The signal's not great up here. Take care of yourself." I ended the call. I don't know exactly how the next weeks went for them. I'd installed a small camera in my old apartment before I left, the kind used for pet monitoring, small enough to sit behind a bookshelf. I checked it once. I saw my mother and Rosa arguing in the kitchen over a box of crackers, a real argument, the kind that leaves marks. I saw Rosa point at the door. I closed the feed. I set the phone face down on the kitchen table and went to make tea. Outside, the snow was 4 feet against the windows and still coming. There were hard days. Weeks in, there were mornings where the wind off the ridge was so loud the windows flexed, and I'd lie awake listening, running through the inventory in my head like a rosary. But Max was there, which meant there was always someone to talk to, always someone who could take the second watch when the generator needed checking or the firewood needed rotating. We played cards. We read books we'd grabbed from the villa's previous owner's shelves. We cooked actual meals, not just survival calories, real food, soups and stews, and once a pasta with canned clams that was genuinely good. There were 3 months of hard cold, then a slow thaw that took another 2 months to become real. The morning the radio announced that FEMA was establishing survival and recovery centers, that roads were being cleared, that people could begin moving again, Max and I were standing at the front door of the villa in heavy coats, watching the first pale sunlight come through clouds that had been solid gray since October. He laughed when I said it. I didn't think I'd ever be this warm again. He had a nice laugh. He always had. We walked out together, down the snow-crusted path to the road where a recovery truck was idling. A volunteer with a clipboard asked our names. I gave them. She checked a box. I did not call my mother. I did not call Rosa. I had no interest in finding out what shape they were in, not from cruelty, but because I'd already made my peace with that door being closed. In my first life, I'd kept walking back through it, kept hoping that the next time I knocked, someone would open it differently. They never did. This time I had Max. That was enough. It had always been enough. I just needed to be shown. I didn't have to be shown twice. Story 6. The granddaughter's revenge. I came back to life on the sofa. Not the cold floor of a shelter. Not the backseat of a stranger's truck. Not wherever they'd left what was left of me after 3 years of a world that had decided I wasn't worth keeping. I came back on the living room sofa with a knit throw over my legs and the afternoon light coming through the bay window, warm and gold and absolutely ordinary. I was home. For a moment, I just lay there and breathed, cataloging every sensation with a greed I hadn't felt since before the cold came. The smell of my mother's cooking from the kitchen. She was making something with ginger. The distant sound of my father's car in the driveway. The particular comfort of a sofa I'd fallen asleep on 1,000 times. Everything intact. Everyone alive. I stood up. My legs worked. I walked to the kitchen doorway. My mother was at the stove. She turned when she heard me and smiled the way she always did, warm and automatic, the expression of a woman who was simply glad her family was home. "You're up. Did you sleep well?" I crossed the kitchen and put my arms around her from behind and held on. She laughed, surprised. "Celia, what's gotten into you?" "Nothing," I said. "I'm just glad you're here." 20 minutes later, I heard my father come through the front door. I was already in the hallway. He came in with his briefcase and his coat and his expression of mild end-of-day exhaustion, and I grabbed his sleeve. "Don't drive the company car tomorrow," I said. He stopped. He looked at me, really looked, the way he did when he understood something was serious. My father ran 5 garment factories. He'd built the business himself over 20 years, starting with nothing and ending with a net worth that made people treat him differently at dinners. But he'd never been a man who dismissed the women in his family. He looked at me now and saw that I meant it. "Why?" he said. "Call your mechanic first, have the brake lines checked." I held his gaze. "Please." He called his mechanic that evening. The mechanic called back the next morning. The brake fluid line had been cut. Subtle, professional, the kind of cut that would have looked like a catastrophic failure under highway conditions, the kind of thing that would have been recorded as an accident. My father went very still when the mechanic described it. He stood in the driveway for a long time after he hung up. My mother cried. She sat at the kitchen table with her hands over her face and cried in a way I hadn't seen her cry before, quietly, without wanting to be seen, which made it worse. I sat beside her and put my hand over hers and told her what I knew. All of it. What Grandma, me, and Blake had planned, what they had done, what they would have done if I hadn't come back in time. I told her what happened to me after, the cold, the shelter, the thing that Blake and Grandma me did when they were desperate enough to have nothing left but cruelty. When I finished, my father was standing in the doorway. He'd been there for a while, listening. His face was controlled in that way it got when he was feeling something too large for his expression to contain. "What do we need to do?" he said. We moved fast, and we moved quietly. The first thing my father did was call his attorney. The family business was worth approximately $50 million at current valuation. He began the transfer process that same week, a sale to a business partner, structured to look like a standard acquisition, the kind of transaction that happens in his industry all the time. Blake and Grandma me weren't told. They weren't consulted. As far as they knew, Dad was in discussions about an expansion deal. He paid cash for the building. It was a high-rise on the north side of the city, 15 floors of mixed-use commercial space that had sat partially vacant since a development company ran out of capital 3 years prior. The price, for cash and a fast close, was $15 million. The building had a steel frame, modern insulation, reinforced windows, and a basement mechanical room that could be converted to accommodate a large boiler. They moved us into the 29th floor. The floors below became warehouses. Floors above 30 were gutted and converted into residential units that could hold perhaps 40 people in reasonable comfort. My mother knew people. She had spent 20 years building relationships with pharmaceutical reps, hospital supply managers, medical distributors. She called in every favor. Within 2 weeks, the warehouse floors held antibiotics in quantity, antivirals, a cold storage room packed with insulin and specialized medications, pallets of freeze-dried food, cases of water filtration equipment, winter clothing ranging from sizes children small to men's XXL, and coal. Enough coal, if managed carefully, to last 5 years. My father bought gold. He did it quietly, through a brokerage he trusted, and stored it in a secured room on the 28th floor. In a world where currency might not survive the next 3 years, gold would still mean something when the thaw came. Blake and Grandma me, I need to explain them, because they've sat at the center of my thoughts for so long that I sometimes forget how ordinary their evil looked from the outside. Grandma me was my father's mother, a small woman in her early 70s who wore her hair pinned and her opinions like armor. She had decided, somewhere around the time my father married my mother and built something that didn't need her permission, that the family's wealth belonged to her bloodline by right, specifically to Blake, her late daughter's son, whom she had raised and spoiled into something that had no function beyond taking things. Blake was 26. He'd never held a job for more than 4 months. He smiled with all his teeth and called me cuz, and had once, at a family dinner, reached across the table and taken the piece of cake my mother had saved for me without asking. A small thing, but I had never forgotten it. My father distracted them in the simplest way possible. He offered Blake a deal. He told Blake that he was liquidating the family home as part of a restructuring and that Blake could purchase it at below market price as a family courtesy. Blake, predictably, jumped at it. He saw a chance to own something with other people's labor embedded in its walls, and he took it without reading anything carefully. My father took the money, added it to the gold reserves, and said nothing about where we were going. On the day we moved the last boxes to the high-rise, Grandma, me, and Blake arrived at the family house unannounced. They found it empty. They called my father, who was standing in the elevator of our new building with a cup of coffee and no particular urgency. "We're traveling," he told them. "Don't call us." He didn't give them the address. He didn't tell them where the business had gone or whom to contact. He was a man who had discovered that his mother had tried to have him killed, and he had decided that the appropriate response was neither confrontation nor cruelty. Just absence, clean and total. The cold arrived 3 days after we moved in. I'd known it was coming. I'd known the date, more or less, the way you know the shape of a nightmare you've lived through once already. I'd told my parents, and they'd believed me, and when the temperature dropped 20 degrees in 2 hours on a Thursday morning, my father stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of the 29th floor and watched it happen with an expression that was very calm and very sad. "You saw this," he said. "I saw this," I said. My mother brought tea. Within 24 hours, the city was under 2 feet of snow. The temperature read -80°C at the ground. The high-rise groaned in the wind but held steel frame, modern engineering, and a boiler system running on coal that kept every habitable floor at 65 degrees. We watched from the windows as the city below turned white, and then gray, and then still. Grandma, me, and Blake were in the old family house. It had the original windows and the original gas line that the city had cut when pressure dropped across the grid. No backup heat, no insulation worth mentioning. Blake, as far as I could tell from the one phone call he made to my father in those early weeks, a frantic, disbelieving call that my father answered and listened to without expression, had not prepared anything. He had bought the house because it was a good deal, not because he understood what a house required. Over the months that followed, we learned to live at altitude. My mother organized the medical supplies with a system so precise that she could tell you the exact shelf location of any item in under 30 seconds. My father managed the building's resources with the same instinct he'd used to run 5 factories, methodically, without waste, always thinking 3 steps ahead. I helped where I could. I was good at inventory. I was good at keeping records. I was good, it turned out, at growing things. On the 27th floor, under UV lights rigged to the building's generator system, we grew bean sprouts, then spinach, then small amounts of tomatoes from seeds we'd stored. It was never enough to feed everyone entirely, but it was green and it was alive, and there were mornings when the light through the growing racks looked almost like sunlight, and I stood in that room and felt something I hadn't felt in a very long time. We celebrated birthdays. We celebrated Thanksgiving with a freeze-dried turkey casserole that was better than it had any right to be. We celebrated Christmas with a small tree fashioned from wire and green-painted paper that my mother's assistant had thought to bring. We were, against everything, happy. Blake attempted to steal from neighboring buildings in the 4th month and was caught. Someone in a competing survivor group slashed his arm from elbow to wrist. He survived, but lost significant function in 2 fingers. Grandma me developed hypothermia at some point and was eventually taken to a city emergency shelter by a volunteer crew that was doing sweeps of abandoned residential blocks. She survived. Barely. 3 years. 3 winters and 2 partial thaws that teased at spring without delivering it, and then one morning the radio announced a genuine warming front and the snowpack on the street below began, slowly, to change color from white to gray to a dull brown that meant it was melting. We walked out into sunlight. My mother held my father's arm. He was older than when I'd come back. 3 years of managing a building through a civilizational crisis will do that. But he was upright and his eyes were clear. My mother looked at him, and then at me, and then at the street, which was rivers of snowmelt running toward the drains, and she exhaled like she was letting go of something very heavy. I visited Grandmommy 3 weeks later. She was in a recovery shelter on the east side, a church gymnasium converted to long-term housing. She was at a table near the window, thinner than I remembered, her hair loose instead of pinned. She looked up when I walked in and something moved across her face that might have been relief and might have been guilt and might have been both. She reached for my hand. I let her reach. I didn't take it. I set an envelope on the table in front of her. Inside was a cashier's check, enough to cover a private assisted living facility for what remained of her life. A good one with meals and medical care and a garden view. She looked at it. She looked at me. She opened her mouth. "I don't need anything from you," I said. It wasn't angry. I'd been angry for a long time in my first life. Right up to the end, I'd been so angry I could barely think past it. Now I was just clear. Not an apology, not an explanation. This is for my father, because he would want you to be cared for, even now. Not because you deserve it, because he does. I walked out. The sunlight outside was weak and new, the way March sunlight is when it has a lot of work to do. I tilted my face up to it and stood there for a moment on the shelter steps. I didn't need Me's remorse. I didn't need Blake's reckoning written out in satisfying detail. I had my parents, alive, unhurt, standing in the sunlight of a rebuilt world, because I had come back in time to pull them out of the path of a woman who had decided their lives were worth less than her preferences. That was everything. That was the whole of what I needed. I walked back to where they were waiting. Story 7, The Wrong Homecoming. I woke up on a Tuesday. I knew it was Tuesday because Weston was on the couch playing the same racing game he always played on Tuesdays, the one with the orange menu screen that glowed in the half-dark of the living room. The apartment smelled like delivery pizza. My coat was hung by the door. I sat up in bed and stared at the ceiling and breathed in and out until I was sure. I was back. 2 weeks back. Specifically, I knew the date from the phone on the nightstand. 14 days before the cold. Before Weston looked at the farmhouse that I'd bought with money I'd saved for 3 years and decided that the math of survival worked out better without me in it. I lay there for a while, listening to the game sounds from the living room. I thought about the first time I'd understood that Weston was going to let me die. Not a dramatic moment. No argument, no confrontation. He just stood at the farmhouse door one morning, when the temperature outside had already dropped past anything survivable, and told me there wasn't enough food for 2 people and that I'd have to go. As if I hadn't been the one who bought the food. As if I hadn't been the one who'd driven out to that farmhouse 6 days before the cold hit and spent every available hour converting it into something livable. As if the deed weren't in my name, I got up. I went to the kitchen. I made coffee. Weston came in around noon, set his game controller down, and looked in the refrigerator. "We need groceries," he said, to no one in particular. "I'll go later," I said. I did not go to buy groceries. I called my realtor. The farmhouse was already in my name, had always been in my name because it had always been my money. Weston had contributed to the idea of it in the way he contributed to most things. With enthusiasm that evaporated at the first practical requirement. The deed was mine, the mortgage was mine. The farmhouse was, in every actual sense, mine. In my first life, I'd thought of it as ours. I'd been trying to give him something. He'd taken it the way he took everything, completely, without acknowledgement, without gratitude, without understanding that it was possible to be given something and also to owe something in return. I stopped the deed transfer that afternoon. There was one final paperwork step I hadn't completed yet. It sat in my email as an unsigned form, waiting. I didn't sign it. Instead, I called the closing attorney and confirmed the property was solely and completely mine and had been since the initial filing. Then I drove to the farmhouse. It was a 3-hour drive, out of the city into hill country, up a county road that turned to gravel in the last mile. The farmhouse was a square, solid thing with thick plaster walls and a tin roof and a front porch that wrapped around 2 sides. It had a good fireplace. It had a root cellar. In my first life, I'd spent 6 days there before Weston showed up. In this life, I had 2 weeks. I worked from a list I'd made in my head during the drive, and then refined on paper when I got there, and then executed with a focus that I recognized as something new. In my first life, I'd always half believed that someone else might help, that Weston might come through, that the situation might resolve itself, that love meant a person wouldn't let you freeze. I didn't believe any of that now. There was only the list. Wood stove, installed by a local contractor I'd found online, paid in cash, done in a single afternoon. It sat in the center of the main room and threw heat like a small sun. Generator, a dual-fuel unit, heavy enough that I needed a dolly to position it under the back overhang. I ran the transfer cable through the wall myself, which took 2 hours and 3 YouTube tutorials. Food, I drove to 3 different stores across 2 counties to avoid the kind of attention that comes from buying everything in one place. Hundreds of pounds of dry goods, rice, lentils, dried beans, oats, cornmeal, pasta, dried mushrooms, 24 cases of canned vegetables and fish, salt and oil in quantity, sugar, coffee, a case of good instant miso, water, 50-gallon sealed containers, a hand pump filtration system, and 12 flats of bottled water for the first week when I might not have the pump set up. Preserved goods, I spent 2 days canning. 36 jars of dried apple rings, pickled cabbage, fermented hot sauce, bean and vegetable soup bases. I pressure canned everything that needed it. I labeled every jar with a paint marker. I stacked them in the root cellar in neat rows. Blankets. I had 3 sleeping bags rated to -40, 4 wool blankets, a pair of down quilts, and 2 sets of heavy thermal underlayers. All of it packed in vacuum-sealed bags. I went back to the apartment 3 times during those 2 weeks. Each time, I removed things. Weston didn't notice the first time. It was his winter coat and the extra sleeping bag he never used, and I told him I was doing a donation run. He didn't notice the second time, when I took both space heaters and the heavy wool throw from the bedroom chair. The third time, the morning I came for the thermal gloves and the electric blanket, he was still asleep. I stood in the bedroom doorway and looked at him. 10 years. We'd been together 10 years, and before that, we'd been the kind of childhood friends who made each other's families believe something lasting would come of it. Maybe something could have. But Weston had decided long ago that comfort was something that happened to you, not something you made happen, and that the people in his life existed to provide it. I had spent 10 years trying to be enough of an engine for both of us. The last evening I was in the apartment, he looked up from the game and said, "You're going somewhere?" "Work trip," I said. "There's $100 in the kitchen drawer for food." He looked at me for a moment. Something moved through his expression, something like the early shape of a question, the faint outline of attention, as if he was almost going to ask something real. He looked back at the screen. "Okay," he said. I left. I was sitting in the farmhouse with a wood fire going and a bowl of rice and canned fish when the cold hit. I'd set the outdoor thermometer on the porch railing, and I watched it through the window as the temperature moved. 60 degrees at 8 in the morning, 40 by noon, 14 degrees by 6 in the evening. I put another log on the fire and pulled my blanket tighter and finished my dinner. His calls started the next day. I let them ring the first 2 times. I answered the third. I don't entirely know why, some residual habit of 9 years, and he was scared, genuinely scared, his voice stripped of the usual easy confidence. "Where are you? It's insane outside. The pipes froze, there's no heat. Grace, where are you?" "The roads are dangerous," I said. "I can't get back right now. I need you to come back. There's no food in the house." "There's $100 in the drawer," I said. "Order delivery." He started to say something else. I ended the call. I blocked him after the third attempt. The weeks that followed were the quietest I'd had in years. I developed a rhythm. I got up at 6 and stoked the fire and made coffee and ate a real breakfast, oats with dried fruit, or cornmeal mush with honey, or fried rice with egg. I did kettlebell workouts in the main room, which was large enough if you rearranged the furniture. I read for 2 hours in the afternoon. I maintained the generator and the water supply, and the wood stack with the kind of attention that becomes meditative when you do it every day. In the evenings, when the temperature outside dropped to levels that made the windows flex, I sat by the fire and listened to it and felt, strangely, peaceful. He found me in the 3rd week. I don't know how, maybe a record somewhere, maybe a property search he finally thought to run, maybe someone who'd seen me coming and going at the county hardware store. He appeared at the gate at dusk, visible from the upstairs window as a shape moving through the white. I watched him come up the road. He wasn't dressed for it. A winter coat, yes, but not the right kind, not insulated enough for what the temperature had become. No gloves. His face was already wrong, flushed in patches in the way that meant cold damage was starting. He reached the gate and grabbed the latch and found it locked and started calling my name. I stood at the upstairs window and watched him. I thought about everything I'd brought to that farmhouse. Every item, every hour, every dollar I'd earned and spent on building something that could keep a person alive for 6 months. I thought about the morning in my first life when he'd stood at the farmhouse door and told me there wasn't enough for 2. I went to the kitchen. I filled 2 large pots from the stove, brought them to full boil, and carried them up the stairs with oven mitts. The window in the upstairs bedroom faced the gate directly. I opened it 6 inches, just enough. He saw me. He started talking fast, explaining, pleading, telling me it wasn't his fault, telling me he hadn't known it would be this bad. I let him talk. When he ran down, I said, "You had 10 years to change. You had 3 days to prepare. You chose not to." I tilted both pots out the window. In -80 Celsius, boiling water doesn't reach the ground as liquid. The thermal shock catches it almost immediately. You get a fraction of a second of scalding contact, and then the water flash freezes as it hits cold air, coating whatever it lands on in a shell of ice. He made a sound. Then he went down. I closed the window. I went back downstairs. I sat in the chair by the fireplace with the book I'd been reading, a thick novel I'd been looking forward to for months, and I turned to my page and read until the fire needed another log. The cold lasted 2 months. In the 8th week, I noticed the thermometer ticking upward, slowly, reluctantly, a few degrees at a time. By the 10th week, it was above freezing in the afternoons. By the 12th, the snow was melting off the roof in thin sheets that slid down the tin and landed on the porch with a sound like applause. I walked outside into weak spring sunlight. He was at the gate. Or rather, what remained of him was at the gate, ice form, half buried in the drift that had accumulated against the fence posts over the months, only the shape of him still visible under the accumulated snowpack. I stood on the porch and looked at it for a moment. I went back inside and got my phone and dialed the city's recovery line. I gave them the coordinates. I gave them my name. I told them there was a body at the gate that would need collection. Then I went inside and made coffee. I didn't stay to watch the recovery crew. I had things to do. The farmhouse needed an assessment, the root cellar needed to be inventoried, and I'd been thinking for the past 2 months about what I was going to do with the place when the world started up again. It was good land. The soil in the side yard, once it thawed, would be good for a kitchen garden. There was a stream a quarter-mile back that would run clean again once the snowmelt sorted itself out. I'd given him 10 years. I'd given him a farmhouse and 3 days of warning in the only language he ever understood, which was absence, the absence of me, the absence of everything I'd quietly removed from our shared life. I had given him, in the end, one more chance. It was enough. It was more than enough. The coffee was good. The morning was quiet. I sat on the porch and watched the snow melt off the hills and tried to decide what to plant first. Story 8. The supermarket survivor. I was at my desk. That's where I came back, not sprawled in the snow outside a locked steel door, not in the moment of final cold darkness, but at my desk with my review notes spread in front of me and the date showing on my phone screen and the number of days between now and the apocalypse reading exactly 7. 7 days. I sat very still for a moment. The review notes were for the graduate school entrance exam, 3 months of work, organized by subject, color-coded in a system I'd developed when I still believed it mattered. I looked at them. I looked at the date on my phone. I thought about Sophie, about the testing center, about the power failure, about the accident on the road in the cold. I thought about Jaden, the way his face had looked when he'd turned it toward me the last time, full of a grief he'd decided to wear as accusation. I picked up the phone and called Supervisor Wang. She answered with her usual directness, no preamble, just, "Ivy, what do you need?" "I'm not taking the exam," I said. "I want to keep working. Can I use the 5th floor stockroom, officially like a full assignment?" A pause, then, "You're one of my best workers." "Yes, come in Monday and we'll do the paperwork." She was curious, I could tell, but she wasn't the kind of person who asked questions she didn't need the answers to. That was why I trusted her. I hung up and looked around the apartment. It was a mess, in the way the apartment was always a mess. Jaden's gaming setup taking up 2/3 of the main room, takeout containers on the counter, his jacket on the floor where he dropped it the night before. He was asleep. It was 11 in the morning and he was asleep, because he had been between jobs for 4 months and had arranged his life accordingly. I made a mental list. Everything in this apartment that I had paid for. Everything soft and warm and functional. It was a long list. I started moving things on Wednesday, 3 days before the cold. I did it gradually, the way you move things when you don't want to explain yourself. A bag here, a box there, loading my car between my afternoon supermarket shifts and driving to the back lot where Supervisor Wang had let me begin setting up the 5th floor stockroom as a secondary prep space. I brought the heavy blankets, the thermal underlayers, the good sleeping bag, my kettle and my 2 good pots, the propane camp stove, the box of candles, the battery-powered lantern, the first aid kit. Jaden noticed the space heater was gone on Thursday morning. "Have you seen the space heater?" "I donated it," I said. "It was an old one." He looked at me with that mild, unfocused irritation he deployed when inconvenienced. "We needed that." "I'll get a new one," I said. I did not get a new one. On Thursday afternoon, Sophie texted into our 3-way group chat, the one the 3 of us had maintained since college, the one I'd been rereading over the past 2 days with new eyes and seeing clearly for the first time. She was canceling their plans. "I won't stay over tonight." Jaden messaged me immediately after, "Ivy, what's wrong with you lately? Sophie just wants to borrow our couch." The particular phrasing, "what's wrong with you," delivered in response to Sophie's plans changing, as if my behavior was responsible for Sophie's decisions, as if they were that closely linked. "Sure," I typed back. "Sophie can stay." Sophie moved in that same night. I told Jaden I was staying at the supermarket to handle a receiving shift that ran late and then another, and then I simply stopped coming home. He didn't call until the second day. Neither of them seemed particularly bothered. I went back to the apartment one last time on Friday, ostensibly to pick up some files for work. I let myself in with my key and found them on the couch, Sophie's feet in Jaden's lap, both of them watching something on his phone with their heads angled together. Neither of them noticed me in the doorway. I took a photo, not with any dramatic intention. I took it because I wanted to have it, wanted the record of what I'd already known and hadn't allowed myself to name. Then I messaged Supervisor Wang. Heads up, there's a significant weather event coming in the next few days. You should make sure the building's backup heat is fully operational. She trusted me. She'd have it checked. I walked out of the apartment and didn't look back. The cold hit on exam day. It arrived the way it always did, fast and total, the temperature dropping 40 degrees by mid-morning, then continuing. The power grid failed across the east side of the city by early afternoon. Sophie had gotten up early to go to the exam testing center. She was there with 300 other test takers when the electricity went out and the emergency protocols failed to fully activate and the building got very cold very fast. The roads were impassable by noon. I was on the 5th floor of the supermarket. I want to describe that room the way it deserves to be described, because I had built it carefully, and it was, by the time the cold hit, genuinely good. It was approximately 800 square feet of storage space, with reinforced shelving along 3 walls. I had filled those shelves over the course of 3 days. Freeze-dried meals in rotation, canned goods organized by category, sealed buckets of rice and oats and dried lentils, cases of bottled water, water filtration equipment, 3 propane stoves with enough fuel for 6 months of careful use, medical supplies, a battery bank connected to 2 rooftop solar panels. I'd convinced Supervisor Wang to let me install as a testing project. There was a folding cot in the corner with my good sleeping bag on it. There was a small bookshelf I'd made from a wood pallet already loaded with books. It was warm. It was organized. It was mine. Jaden called on day 3. I let it ring twice. Then I picked up because I wanted to hear it one more time, the voice of a man who had, in my first life, looked at everything I'd built and decided the most efficient path forward was to remove me from it. Where are you? He was trying to sound controlled. He wasn't quite making it. There's no food here. The heat's out. Sophie's not. Sophie didn't come back from the exam center and I can't reach anyone. Oh no, I said. I kept my voice careful, warm, worried. Are you okay? The roads are so bad I can't get back. I've been trapped at the store. It's been crazy here. A pause. Is there anything in the kitchen? I think there was some pasta. There's nothing, he said. You took everything. I took some things for the office donation drive, I said. I didn't realize. He said something profane. I let him. I'll try to figure something out, I said. Be safe. I hung up. I made dinner, miso soup with rehydrated mushrooms and a scoop of rice. I ate it at a small folding table I'd set up near the south-facing windows where the last of the afternoon light came through. Outside, the city was buried. The streets below were unrecognizable, cars buried to their rooftops, the usual landmarks reduced to shapes and angles under accumulating white. The temperature on my outdoor sensor read -58 Fahrenheit. I built a routine. I exercised every morning, jumping jacks, push-ups, kettlebell swings in the cleared center of the room. I cooked real meals, not just survival calories. I read for 3 hours every afternoon. I maintained the equipment, checked the solar battery levels, rotated the food stock according to my system. I organized the entire supply room into labeled zones. I slept well. Day 20, I heard them at the steel loading door on the ground level. Jaden's voice first, which I recognized through the wall, and then Sophie's. Sophie had survived the testing center, which meant she'd done something right or been lucky or both. They were shouting my name. Then they were pounding on the door. I went to the second-floor window that faced the side of the building and opened it 4 inches. They looked up. Jaden's face, I'd spent years reading that face, knowing its shifts and its angles, and I could read it even from here. There was relief when he saw me, the particular relief of a person who decided that the thing they wanted was still available, still obtainable. Ivy, he said, thank God, open the door. I looked at them for a moment. Sophie was standing slightly behind him. She looked rough, genuinely rough, like the 2 weeks had been very hard. I felt something complicated about that. I didn't let it move me. Jaden, I said, I know about you and Sophie. I've known for a while. He went still. Then his expression rearranged itself. I watched it happen, the shifting from relief to something that wanted to be self-righteous, the reaching for an argument. This isn't the time to do this, Ivy. Just open the door. It's not the time, I agreed. You should have thought about what time it was 6 months ago. Sophie said from behind him. Jaden, stop. Shut up, he said to her. Not angrily, just flatly. The way he said it to people, he'd temporarily run out of use for. Something shifted in Sophie's face. He turned back to the window and his voice changed, became harder, the way it got when he decided to be done with negotiations. Open the door or I'm breaking in. He found a length of steel pipe somewhere in the side lot and broke the lower window. Sophie screamed at him to stop. He wasn't stopping. What happened between them after that? In the minutes I couldn't see from the upstairs window, I only know from the sounds. An argument that escalated past what arguments should be. Then silence. Then just Jaden's footsteps alone coming back. He stood below the window, his face was different now. The hard thing was gone. What was left was small and frightened, the face of a person who has just done something they can't undo and is only just understanding that fact. Ivy. His voice was thin. Please, I looked at him. Do you remember what you said to me? I asked. In my last life, you said it was my fault she died. He stared at me. He didn't understand. He would never understand. That was the thing about this life versus that one. In that life, he'd had a grief to use as a weapon, and he'd used it without hesitation, without checking whether it was true, without any consideration for what it cost me. He'd kicked me out of a building I'd stalked into the cold that I'd predicted, and he'd done it wearing the face of a victim. I went to the kitchen area. I filled the 2 large prep buckets, the industrial ones I used for food storage, each holding 5 gallons, with water from the heated drum I kept on the propane stove. I carried them to the 2nd floor window. In temperatures that cold water flash freezes on contact with the air. It takes less than 2 seconds. At -80 Celsius, the physics of it are simple. The thermal gradient is so extreme that the water transitions from liquid to solid almost simultaneously with exposure. He would have felt the initial heat for perhaps a fraction of a second. Then the cold. I poured both buckets. Then I closed the window and stepped back. I went downstairs to my cot and lay down and looked at the ceiling. I thought I'd feel something more complex, guilt, maybe, or the specific ache of a long relationship ending badly. Instead, I felt quiet. The way you feel when something has been building for a long time and has finally resolved. I slept. Spring arrived slowly that year, the way it does after a real winter, tentative, in degrees, testing the ground before committing. I woke up one morning in the 8th week to find the sensor reading above freezing for the first time, and I went to the window and opened it all the way and stood there for a long time breathing in air that smelled like melt and cold concrete and something green trying to begin underneath the ice. I packed my bag. It wasn't a large bag. After months of living only with what I needed, I'd learned that most things weren't necessary. A change of clothes, my books, the journal I'd kept, the solar battery bank, which could be useful, my good knife. I walked down the stairs of the supermarket with the bag over one shoulder. I pushed open the ground floor door and stepped out into a morning that was cold but not lethal, the kind of cold that felt like air instead of a weapon. I thought about Supervisor Wang, who'd believed me about the weather and was likely fine. I thought about the grad school exam I hadn't taken and felt nothing about it, or rather, felt a specific clarity about it, the understanding that I'd been studying for that exam because I thought it was what you were supposed to do next, not because I wanted whatever came after it. I knew how to stock a building. I knew how to manage a supply rotation, maintain equipment, build systems for keeping people alive. I knew how to remain calm when things went wrong. Those turned out to be the skills that mattered. I'd figured that out in a supermarket, in -80-degree weather alone. I started walking. There'd be work to do in whatever the city looked like now. There always was, and I was good at work. I'd always been good at it, better than I'd given myself credit for, better than anyone around me had bothered to notice. I'd learned to stock shelves because I needed a job. I'd kept doing it because Supervisor Wang was decent and the work was real and I was good at it. I found out why when it counted. That was enough. That was everything, actually. I walked into spring and didn't look back. Story 9. The cat and the Hotpot the bracelet was $180,000, and Mason was holding it like it was already his. She'll definitely approve of our marriage if I give her this, he said, turning the thing under the jewelry store's halogen lights. The diamonds caught and scattered. He had that look on his face, the one I used to mistake for excitement, but had eventually learned to read as calculation. I was standing beside him with Timmy's carrier in one hand, the soft, familiar weight of him shifting as he settled against the mesh. 7 pounds of orange tabby who'd survived more than either of us deserved. I looked at Mason's profile. I looked at the bracelet. I looked at the jeweler, who was doing her professional best to appear neutral, and then it hit me. Not like a memory, more like a tide coming in. The whole of it at once. 6 months dead, a frozen body somewhere in what used to be our apartment, and Mason standing next to Sophia in a kitchen that had been mine, eating the last of the canned goods I'd been too naive to hide. I'd been dead for 6 months the last time I held that bracelet. I reached out, took it gently from Mason's hand, and set it on the velvet tray. "Miss," the jeweler said. I picked up Timmy's carrier. I walked out of the store. Kylie, what are you doing?" Mason's voice behind me, rising with that particular note, not hurt, not confused, just annoyed that the script had changed. "Kylie," I didn't turn around. The mall hummed around me, tinny pop music from a clothing store, a kid crying near the food court escalator. Normal Saturday sounds. I had 7 days left of normal Saturday sounds, and I intended to use them well. Outside in the gray November air, I sat down on a bench and unzipped Timmy's carrier, just enough to let him bump his head against my wrist. He did it twice, slow and deliberate. "I know," I said. "We're going home, a different home." The property had been sitting empty for 2 years. My parents had left me 3 things: a modest savings account, a tendency to overthink, and a house in what used to be a quiet residential block that was now zoned for eventual redevelopment. It was nothing special, 2 stories, older construction, the kind of place where the floors were solid oak because nobody cut corners in 1978. I called the property manager from the bench outside the mall. "The Woo Street property," I said. "I want to move in, tonight if possible." A pause. "Miss Chen, that property hasn't been, there's no furniture, the utilities need to be, can you turn on the utilities today?" Another pause. Yes, I think so. "Then that's all I need. I have furniture." I didn't have furniture, technically. I had a sleeping bag, Timmy, and a list in my head that was so clear and detailed it felt like a printout. The knowledge of everything I'd wish I'd done. I went back into the mall, not to the jewelry counter. I went to the basement. The food court's commercial supply manager was a tired-looking man named Gerald who clearly expected me to be a restaurant owner wanting to complain about a delivery. I explained, politely but without much preamble, that I wanted to purchase bulk goods. He pulled out a clipboard and raised an eyebrow. 50 boxes of instant ramen," I said. 30 boxes of freeze-dried rice. Canned meats, whatever you have the most of, I'll take 20 cases. Sealed water, the 5-gallon barrels if you have them. First aid kits, at least 6. Gerald's eyebrow stayed up. "That's a significant order for a private individual." "Yes," I agreed. I named a price that was 15% above his usual wholesale margin. "Delivery tomorrow morning before 10. I'll pay today." He put the eyebrow down and picked up a pen. I tipped him well at the register, not extravagantly, enough that he'd remember it fondly, enough that the delivery would be his priority. I walked out of the mall with Timmy, a sleeping bag, a box of kitchen essentials I'd picked up at a home goods store, and a lighter feeling in my chest than I'd had in years. Or in a lifetime, I suppose. Mason showed up at the Woo Street house at 7 p.m. I don't know how he found it, probably checked my parents' documents, or called around. He was persistent that way, especially when he sensed something slipping. He knocked, then he knocked again. I opened the door because I'd decided I wanted to do this one thing cleanly. "Kylie, what happened today? We need to talk about the bracelet, about why are you here, whose house is this?" "Mine," I said. "My parents left it to me. You never asked about anything that wasn't useful to you." He shifted his jaw in that way he had. "That's not fair. I love you. I'm trying to build a future for us, and you walked away from a bracelet that would have gotten my mother too. I know about you and Sophia." The shift was subtle. A tightening around the eyes, the briefest recalibration. "What? Kylie, that's nothing's happening with Sophia." I'd kept the photo for 2 years in the previous life, never using it because I hadn't wanted it to be true. In this life I'd kept it too, but for different reasons. I pulled out my phone and showed it to him. The timestamp was from 14 months ago, Sophia's apartment. The angle was accidental. I'd borrowed her phone once to send myself a file and found it in her camera roll. Mason looked at the photo. He looked at me. "I'm done," I said. I closed the door. Timmy was sitting on the sleeping bag in the corner of the empty living room, washing his face with one paw. He paused, looked at the door, and then went back to washing. Good instincts, that cat. The credit card situation took most of the next morning. I'd suspected it in the previous life, noticed numbers that didn't add up, statements I couldn't account for, but I'd never pursued it because confronting Mason had always felt like opening a door I wasn't ready to walk through. This time I called the bank at 8 a.m. with the card numbers already memorized. I believe there are fraudulent charges on accounts linked to my name, I said. I'd like to dispute them all and freeze any further activity. There were 4 cards. 3 of them had balances that made my stomach tighten even knowing they were coming. The bank's fraud team was efficient. I spent 2 hours on the phone, but by noon the accounts were frozen and the dispute process was underway. The creative back channel, the small registered debt in Mason's name through a legitimate collection route, took a few more calls and the help of a lawyer I'd worked with before and trusted. It wasn't revenge exactly. It was more like math. He'd borrowed against my credit. I simply made sure the ledger reflected that. Not enough to destroy him. Just enough that the next woman he tried to charm with bracelet budgets would run a background check and find a flag. I felt good about that. The next 3 days were the best I'd had in a long time. I know that sounds strange given the circumstances, living alone in an unfurnished house, sleeping on a camping mat, eating instant noodles for lunch, but there was something in the work of it. The wood stove I had installed in the living room by a contractor, I paid double for same-week service. The windows I sealed with weather stripping and foam tape, going room by room, running my fingers along the frames for drafts. The steel security bar I mounted across the front door, the kind that drops into brackets and doesn't move for anything short of a vehicle. The attic, I went up there with 6 rolls of thick insulation batting and spent an afternoon laying it across the floor joists while Timmy watched from the hatch with professional skepticism. 50 pounds of coal in the garage. 30 gallons of clean water in sealed barrels, plus a secondary water filtration system I ordered for next-day delivery. The house filled up. The house became a home. I'd never had that before, not really. The apartment with Mason had been his stage set, a space arranged for the impression of having it all together, expensive coffee machine, bare marble countertops, nothing that was mine. This house with its old oak floors and its coal stove and its cat sitting on a folded wool blanket by the window, this was actually mine. Day 7 came on a Thursday. I'd been watching the weather apps with the calm of someone who already knows the ending. The forecasts, as they always do before extreme cold events, were badly underestimating it. Significant temperature drop, they said. Potential record low. They had no language for a -80-degree event because it had never happened in recorded history. It had only happened once in my memory, in the life I didn't intend to repeat. The temperature dropped 50 degrees in 4 hours. I watched the thermometer on the window ledge. Outside, the sky turned a strange flat white. Timmy was on the couch next to the wood stove. He kneaded the wool blanket twice and settled into a loaf, eyes half closed, the tips of his paws tucked in. Unbothered, a creature of pure competence. You and me both, I told him. Day 3 of the freeze, Sophia called. I'd considered not picking up, but I found I wanted to hear it, the specific sound of this particular reckoning. I answered. Kylie. Her voice was different than I'd ever heard it. Thin. Kylie, it's so cold. Mason and I ran out of food. The stores were already emptied and we can't. Why did you take everything from the apartment? The ramen, the canned stuff, all your things? That was my stuff, I said pleasantly. The things I bought, you know that, right, Sophia? A silence. We've been friends for 6 years, she said. We have, I agreed. 6 years during which you were sleeping with my boyfriend. I kept my voice warm. Not angry, I was genuinely past the anger by now. Anger requires a belief that things could have been different, and I'd had a long time to stop believing that. The instant noodles and the canned peaches and the freeze-dried meals and the water, I bought all of that, Sophia. With my own money, it's mine. I took it with me when I left. That's not a crime. Another silence. Kylie, please. Take care of yourself, I said. I meant it more or less. Then I hung up. Mason's online performance was a final flourish. He posted 12 messages across 3 platforms over the course of 2 days, first asking for help, then demanding it, then escalating into something that read less like desperation and more like a man used to controlling his narrative losing the thread completely. He claimed his girlfriend had stolen community supplies. He posted her address, the old apartment's address, which was mine, which I no longer lived in. He tried to organize a group to come recover the supplies. No one responded. The power grid was already spotty. Most people had their own problems. I read his posts from the couch with a cup of tea and Timmy in my lap, and I felt almost nothing. That was the truest surprise of the whole ordeal, not the cold, not the logistics, not even the discovery of what people will do when the temperature drops and their options narrow. The surprise was how little space he took up in me anymore. Weeks passed. I read 3 novels I'd been meaning to get to for years. I fed Timmy premium freeze-dried salmon and tuna. I'd bought 40 bags specifically for him, more than enough for 6 months, and watched him develop opinions about which flavor he preferred on which days. He liked tuna on Tuesdays. I don't know why. I respected it. The snow outside the sealed windows was extraordinary. It came in drifts that rose past the first-floor windowsills. I watched it from the warm side of the glass with a second cup of tea and thought about how beautiful things can be when you're not afraid of them. I'd set up a small camera in the old apartment before I left. Not for surveillance, exactly, more like a habit from my previous life when I'd learned, too late, that documentation matters. I checked it occasionally, the way you check a wound that's healing. I needed to know when to stop. I watched Mason and Sophia run out of food. I watched them fight. I watched Mason make contact with a local group of men, the kind who form and organize quickly in resource scarcity situations, the kind I'd known to avoid. I watched him offer Sophia as some kind of collateral, and I turned the camera off before the rest of it. I didn't feel satisfied. I want to be clear about that. I felt tired and a little sad and enormously relieved that I was on this side of the sealed window. That was all. 3 months later, the freeze broke. It happened in stages, a week of temperatures climbing from devastating to merely brutal, then a day when the sky went from flat white to actual gray, and then a morning when I opened the front door and the air hit my face, and it was cold but survivable, the ordinary cold of late winter, the kind that bites your cheeks and makes you want coffee. I stood on the front step for a long time. The street was quiet. The drifts were already starting to slump at the edges. Somewhere down the block, a bird was making noise. I hadn't heard a bird in 3 months. I'd forgotten how ordinary that sound was. I went back inside, put on my coat, got Timmy into his carrier. He accepted this with his usual gravity. There were 2 other cats at the rescue center that had been running on generator power throughout the freeze, a scrappy black and white named Ramai and a large gray female who'd been brought in half frozen and had since recovered her opinions in full. I adopted them both. The intake volunteer, who looked like she hadn't slept in a month, started crying a little when I filled out the paperwork. "We weren't sure anyone would come," she said. "People will come now," I told her. "It's over." I never reopened Mason's contact. His number stayed in my phone for about a week before I deleted it, not in anger, but the way you throw out old receipts. A small administrative task with no emotional weight. The Woo Street house needed some repairs after the freeze, a section of roof, a burst pipe in the basement that I'd forgotten to drain. I fixed them. The oak floors survived perfectly. I'd known they would. I'm not going to tell you I became someone transformed. I didn't discover some profound wisdom or develop a new philosophy of suffering. I came back because I'd had a second chance and I was too stubborn not to use it right this time. That's the whole of it. But I do have 3 cats now, and a wood stove that's just the right size for the living room, and a house that is entirely, thoroughly, actually mine. That's not nothing. Timmy would agree, I think, but he's asleep on his blanket and I've learned not to interrupt him. I came back for myself and Timmy. I left everything else behind. It turns out that's enough. Story 10, the lie he told the neighborhood I was standing at the kitchen counter when Ethan started his pitch. He had this way of doing it, casual at first, like he'd just thought of something, setting down his coffee mug and turning toward me with that particular expression, the one that said he'd been rehearsing since breakfast. The concerned furrow, the measured tone. I'd been married to this man for 4 years, and I'd learned every instrument in his orchestra. "Listen, I've been looking at some data," he said. "Climate projections, some independent researchers. There are people predicting a serious high-temperature event coming. Not just a heat wave, I'm talking a sustained period that could make whole regions uninhabitable. I think we need to take it seriously." He paused. "I've found a contractor. The shelter would run about $200,000. Exactly 2/3 of everything my parents had left me when they died. In my first life, I'd believed him. I'd handed it over because he was my husband and he'd looked at me with those concerned eyes, and I'd wanted to be the kind of person who took precautions, who acted when it mattered. And I'd watched the money disappear into a project I was never shown, into receipts I was never given, into a future that never arrived. What arrived instead was cold. Absolute, historic, unprecedented cold. -100 degrees Celsius by day 3. And me, standing outside a building whose address Ethan had texted me, a fake invitation to a safe shelter, looking up at a balcony where my husband and my best friend Monica stood wrapped in expedition coats, watching me freeze. I heard Monica say something. Ethan laughed. That was the last thing I heard. but I was in my kitchen now, and Ethan was still talking, and I had my hands flat on the counter, and I could feel the cold granite under my palms, and I was alive. I slapped him. Not a movie slap, the kind you see where the hand connects with a stage-perfect crack and the recipient spins. This was harder than I expected. My palm hit his cheek and the sound was flat and real, and Ethan stumbled back against the refrigerator, hand flying up to his face, genuinely shocked. I was a little shocked too. I died for this lie, I said. Never again. The divorce filing was straightforward. I called our attorney's office the same afternoon. What I did next was more considered. I offered Ethan the apartment. It was a good apartment. 12th-floor view, central location, the kind of address that impresses people at dinner parties, which had been very much the point when Ethan lobbied to buy it 3 years ago. He'd always loved it more than I did. I'd always loved the idea that if things went wrong, the apartment was mine, that it was in my name, that it was my security. I watched his face when his attorney called him with the offer. I was across the table in that conference room, and I watched the hunger move through him like weather. He controlled it quickly, he was good at that, but I'd seen it. He thought I was being sentimental. He thought I didn't understand what I was giving away. He was so pleased with that interpretation that he didn't question it at all. What he didn't know, the apartment's building had a structural issue in the foundation. Nothing catastrophic under normal circumstances, but under sustained extreme cold, the kind that turns water to ice and expands in concrete like a fist, the south-facing wall was going to develop a crack that no amount of interior heating would compensate for. I'd learned this the hard way, in a life where I'd wished I could tell the engineers about it 6 months earlier. I signed the papers. I let him have his prize. The LLC was my attorney's suggestion, or rather, my attorney's agreement with what I proposed. We named it something forgettable, a number, a state abbreviation, the word properties. The purchase went through in 4 days, a suburban villa 40 minutes outside the city, the kind of place that looks like someone's country getaway and is therefore invisible. It had what I needed. A greenhouse attached to the south wall, a basement that descended 3 full levels, stone walls a foot thick, and a seller who was motivated and asking no questions. I paid in full. I had my parents to thank for the discipline of keeping my savings separate from the joint account. Ethan had tried, 3 times over our marriage, to suggest consolidation. I deflected each time with a pleasantness that had never been entirely genuine. The next 10 days were mine. I want to describe what it felt like, those 10 days, because I don't think I've fully accounted for them in my own head. I'd spent 4 years in that marriage feeling like a person who was always slightly off-tempo, always responding, always managing, always adjusting to the weather of someone else's moods and schemes. And here I was, alone in a villa I was making into a fortress, and every decision I made was just mine. 200 boxes of preserved food, canned vegetables, canned proteins, sealed grains, freeze-dried meals. I bought from 3 different suppliers so no single order would flag as unusual. 40 bags of coal. The wood-burning furnace I had a professional install in the basement, a serious piece of equipment built for serious cold. Solar panels across the south-facing roof, wired to a battery bank in the basement. A wind turbine on the property's small hill because I'd learned not to rely on a single system. Warm clothing, wool, down, thermal layers. Enough for every permutation of disaster I could imagine, and a few I hoped I was wrong about. Medical supplies, antibiotics, painkillers, wound care, everything the pharmacist would allow me to buy without a prescription, plus a consultation with a doctor I'd worked with professionally who agreed to provide a standing supply authorization in exchange for a substantial donation to a free clinic he supported. I respected that transaction. I closed the real estate office on a Tuesday. My assistant, a young woman named Petra who'd worked with me for 2 years and had better instincts than she gave herself credit for, deserved more than the standard layoff protocol. "I'm closing temporarily," I told her across the desk. "Personal reasons. Here's 3 months of salary, effective today." I pushed the envelope across. "And Petra, stock up on warm things. Heavy coats, blankets, heating supplies. Keep a good supply of food at home." She looked at me with the careful expression of someone deciding whether to ask. "Just in case," I said. She nodded slowly. "How long should I plan for?" "A year," I said. "Maybe more." She took the envelope and she didn't ask anything else. I've thought about that since, whether she believed me, whether she prepared. I hope she did. I'd gone back to the apartment complex twice since the divorce was finalized. Not to see Ethan, I had no interest in seeing Ethan. I went because I still had contacts in the building, older residents I'd managed properties for over the years, people who'd known me since before the marriage and who I had no intention of abandoning to whatever Ethan had planned. The second visit, I saw it. He and Monica were standing in the courtyard. They'd set up a folding table. There were flyers. I stood at the corner and watched Ethan work the crowd, and it was a crowd, maybe 30 residents clustered around him, listening with the particular attentiveness of people who are genuinely frightened. He was telling them about the heat apocalypse, not as a rumor, not as a theory, as fact. Confident, detailed, a man who'd clearly done this before or practiced it, I wasn't sure which. Monica stood beside him and nodded at the right moments. On the table, a stack of pamphlets he'd had printed, a display of cheap box fans and portable air conditioners, a sign that said heat protection package, supplies limited. I watched an older couple, the Garcias, who lived in 4B, who'd bought their unit the same year I'd started my business, examine one of the fans. Mr. Garcia's hand was on their space heater, already detached from the wall, preparing to hand it over. I walked into the courtyard. "Don't sell your winter things to anyone," I said, loud enough to carry. The crowd turned. Ethan turned. "No matter what anyone tells you, you'll need them. The cold that's coming is real and it is not a heat event." I looked around the circle of faces. "Keep your heaters, keep your coats, get more if you can." Ethan's voice, smooth and controlled. "Claire, I think you're confused. Don't sell your winter things," I said again to the room, not to him. Then I looked at him directly. "You know exactly what's coming. You've been preparing for it. You're selling these people a lie so you can take their money and their equipment." Monica had the grace to look at the ground. Ethan's expression was something I recognized, a man performing composure. I walked out of the courtyard. Behind me, I heard him begin to recover, to address the crowd. To reframe, he was good. I didn't stay to counter him. I'd said what I could say. I'd planted the seed. When I got home that evening, I opened a forum account I'd created for exactly this purpose and wrote the post. I kept it specific. The address, the dates, the description of what he was selling and what he was taking, his name, the apartment number. I described the cold preparation supply I knew from watching his orders come in he'd been building in the basement of the apartment, the good heaters, the real gear, all of it for him and Monica. I tagged the local community board. I flagged it for the building's management company. I linked it to the city's Consumer Protection Office. Then I drove back to the villa and checked on the furnace. The cold came at midnight on January 31st. I was in the basement when the temperature started its drop. I'd set up a weather station, 4 outdoor sensors at different distances from the villa, and I watched the numbers in real time on a tablet screen while the furnace ran beside me. 40 degrees to 22 below zero in 30 minutes. By morning, 80 below. I'd known the numbers, but seeing them on screen was still something. The instruments went a little strange at the extremes, flickering. Struggling with readings, they hadn't been calibrated to record. By day 3, the official reports from the one remaining active broadcast station confirmed minus 100 degrees Celsius. I made myself soup over the wood stove because the numbers on a screen feel different when your hands are wrapped around something warm. The forum post had gone somewhere. I found out later, weeks later, from a radio broadcast when signals started returning, that it had circulated significantly before the cold hit. Not universally. Some residents had believed Ethan, or had been convinced by the timeline, or had simply not seen the warning in time. Some had listened. The Garcias had kept their space heater. I found out later they'd survived in their apartment by running it in the bedroom with the door sealed, 12 days on a single heater's worth of warmth while their building bled heat around them. I thought about that often. What happened in the courtyard, I heard only in pieces in the weeks after. The mob formed on the second morning. The forum post had given them the framework and the cold had given them the fury. I don't have complete information and I won't pretend to. I know the building sustained significant damage to the main entrance. I know neither Ethan nor Monica's names appeared on any survivor registration. I didn't watch it. I'd done what I could for the neighbors. The rest was theirs. For the next 18 months, I lived in the villa. I want to be honest. There were hard days. Weeks in the middle of the freeze when the wind turbine sound became a kind of madness, and the basement felt smaller than it was, and I cataloged my supplies for the 4th time in a week just to have something to do with my hands. Isolation is a serious thing. I took it seriously. I kept a journal. Every day, even on the days when the entry was 2 sentences. Even on the days when the entry was just the temperature and what I'd eaten. The act of writing it down, of making a record, felt important in ways I couldn't fully articulate. I grew herbs in the greenhouse. The attached structure stayed warm enough, barely, for rosemary and thyme and a stubborn variety of mint that seemed determined to outlast everything. I dried them and kept them in labeled jars and used them more than I needed to, probably, because the smell of fresh herbs was one of the most ordinary and essential things I could think of. I did yoga in the basement, badly, with no instructor and a body that wasn't used to it. But I did it because movement felt necessary, and I'd read enough about extended isolation to know that the body's routine matters as much as the mind's. I made myself laugh a few times at my own technique. That felt good too. The wind turbine turned through the blizzard. I watched it from the basement window, that slow rotation in impossible cold, and thought about stubbornness as a survival characteristic. When the cold broke, it came slowly, not the dramatic release I might have imagined. Just a morning when the outdoor sensors read 20 below instead of 60, and then a week when the thermometer climbed by increments so small they felt cruel, and then a day when I opened the basement's ground-level window and didn't immediately need to close it. I walked outside on a gray March morning, mud under the snow where it was starting to compact. The air smelled like winter metal, and underneath it, the faint green suggestion of things that had survived. I was the only one in the neighborhood who had prepared correctly. That's not pride, it's a fact. I'd used my professional skills and my knowledge and my resources, and I'd prepared. Other people had skills and knowledge and resources too, and they'd been lied to by someone they trusted in the crucial window. That is not their failure. That is his. She didn't need to punish him. She just needed to tell the truth. The cold did the rest. 3 months after the thaw, I opened a new real estate office. Smaller than the last one room, one employee, Petra, who had prepared, who had done what I'd suggested, who was very much alive and looking for work. I specialized in sustainable housing, passive solar design, thermal mass construction, the kind of buildings that don't depend entirely on a grid that might not always be there. There was a lot of work. Story 10, the lie he told the neighborhood I was standing at the kitchen counter when Ethan started his pitch. He had this way of doing it, casual at first, like he'd just thought of something, setting down his coffee mug and turning toward me with that particular expression, the one that said he'd been rehearsing since breakfast. The concerned furrow, the measured tone. I'd been married to this man for 4 years, and I'd learned every instrument in his orchestra. Listen, I've been looking at some data, he said. Climate projections, some independent researchers. There are people predicting a serious high-temperature event coming. Not just a heat wave, I'm talking a sustained period that could make whole regions uninhabitable. I think we need to take it seriously. He paused. I've found a contractor. The shelter would run about $200,000. Exactly 2/3 of everything my parents had left me when they died. In my first life, I'd believed him. I'd handed it over because he was my husband and he'd looked at me with those concerned eyes, and I'd wanted to be the kind of person who took precautions, who acted when it mattered. And I'd watched the money disappear into a project I was never shown, into receipts I was never given, into a future that never arrived. What arrived instead was cold. Absolute, historic, unprecedented cold. -100 degrees Celsius by day 3. And me, standing outside a building whose address Ethan had texted me, a fake invitation to a safe shelter, looking up at a balcony where my husband and my best friend Monica stood wrapped in expedition coats, watching me freeze. I heard Monica say something. Ethan laughed. That was the last thing I heard. But I was in my kitchen now, and Ethan was still talking, and I had my hands flat on the counter, and I could feel the cold granite under my palms, and I was alive. I slapped him. Not a movie slap, the kind you see where the hand connects with a stage-perfect crack and the recipient spins. This was harder than I expected. My palm hit his cheek and the sound was flat and real, and Ethan stumbled back against the refrigerator, hand flying up to his face, genuinely shocked. I was a little shocked too. I died for this lie, I said. Never again. The divorce filing was straightforward. I called our attorney's office the same afternoon. What I did next was more considered. I offered Ethan the apartment. It was a good apartment. 12th-floor view, central location, the kind of address that impresses people at dinner parties, which had been very much the point when Ethan lobbied to buy it 3 years ago. He'd always loved it more than I did. I'd always loved the idea that if things went wrong, the apartment was mine, that it was in my name, that it was my security. I watched his face when his attorney called him with the offer. I was across the table in that conference room, and I watched the hunger move through him like weather. He controlled it quickly, he was good at that, but I'd seen it. He thought I was being sentimental. He thought I didn't understand what I was giving away. He was so pleased with that interpretation that he didn't question it at all. What he didn't know, the apartment's building had a structural issue in the foundation. Nothing catastrophic under normal circumstances, but under sustained extreme cold, the kind that turns water to ice and expands in concrete like a fist, the south-facing wall was going to develop a crack that no amount of interior heating would compensate for. I'd learned this the hard way, in a life where I'd wished I could tell the engineers about it 6 months earlier. I signed the papers. I let him have his prize. The LLC was my attorney's suggestion, or rather, my attorney's agreement with what I proposed. We named it something forgettable, a number, a state abbreviation, the word properties. The purchase went through in 4 days, a suburban villa 40 minutes outside the city, the kind of place that looks like someone's country getaway and is therefore invisible. It had what I needed. A greenhouse attached to the south wall, a basement that descended 3 full levels, stone walls a foot thick, and a seller who was motivated and asking no questions. I paid in full. I had my parents to thank for the discipline of keeping my savings separate from the joint account. Ethan had tried, 3 times over our marriage, to suggest consolidation. I deflected each time with a pleasantness that had never been entirely genuine. The next 10 days were mine. I want to describe what it felt like, those 10 days, because I don't think I've fully accounted for them in my own head. I'd spent 4 years in that marriage feeling like a person who was always slightly off-tempo, always responding, always managing, always adjusting to the weather of someone else's moods and schemes. And here I was, alone in a villa I was making into a fortress, and every decision I made was just mine. 200 boxes of preserved food, canned vegetables, canned proteins, sealed grains, freeze-dried meals. I bought from 3 different suppliers so no single order would flag as unusual. 40 bags of coal. The wood-burning furnace I had a professional install in the basement, a serious piece of equipment built for serious cold. Solar panels across the south-facing roof, wired to a battery bank in the basement. A wind turbine on the property's small hill because I'd learned not to rely on a single system. Warm clothing, wool, down, thermal layers. Enough for every permutation of disaster I could imagine, and a few I hoped I was wrong about. Medical supplies, antibiotics, painkillers, wound care, everything the pharmacist would allow me to buy without a prescription, plus a consultation with a doctor I'd worked with professionally who agreed to provide a standing supply authorization in exchange for a substantial donation to a free clinic he supported. I respected that transaction. I closed the real estate office on a Tuesday. My assistant, a young woman named Petra who'd worked with me for 2 years and had better instincts than she gave herself credit for, deserved more than the standard layoff protocol. "I'm closing temporarily," I told her across the desk. "Personal reasons. Here's 3 months of salary, effective today." I pushed the envelope across. "And Petra, stock up on warm things. Heavy coats, blankets, heating supplies. Keep a good supply of food at home." She looked at me with the careful expression of someone deciding whether to ask. "Just in case," I said. She nodded slowly. "How long should I plan for?" "A year," I said. "Maybe more." She took the envelope and she didn't ask anything else. I've thought about that since, whether she believed me, whether she prepared. I hope she did. I'd gone back to the apartment complex twice since the divorce was finalized. Not to see Ethan, I had no interest in seeing Ethan. I went because I still had contacts in the building, older residents I'd managed properties for over the years, people who'd known me since before the marriage and who I had no intention of abandoning to whatever Ethan had planned. The second visit, I saw it. He and Monica were standing in the courtyard. They'd set up a folding table. There were flyers. I stood at the corner and watched Ethan work the crowd, and it was a crowd, maybe 30 residents clustered around him, listening with the particular attentiveness of people who are genuinely frightened. He was telling them about the heat apocalypse, not as a rumor, not as a theory, as fact. Confident, detailed, a man who'd clearly done this before or practiced it, I wasn't sure which. Monica stood beside him and nodded at the right moments. On the table, a stack of pamphlets he'd had printed, a display of cheap box fans and portable air conditioners, a sign that said heat protection package, supplies limited. I watched an older couple, the Garcias, who lived in 4B, who'd bought their unit the same year I'd started my business, examine one of the fans. Mr. Garcia's hand was on their space heater, already detached from the wall, preparing to hand it over. I walked into the courtyard. "Don't sell your winter things to anyone," I said, loud enough to carry. The crowd turned, Ethan turned. No matter what anyone tells you, you'll need them. The cold that's coming is real and it is not a heat event. I looked around the circle of faces. Keep your heaters, keep your coats, get more if you can. Ethan's voice, smooth and controlled. Claire, I think you're confused. Don't sell your winter things. I said again to the room, not to him. Then I looked at him directly. You know exactly what's coming. You've been preparing for it. You're selling these people a lie so you can take their money and their equipment. Monica had the grace to look at the ground. Ethan's expression was something I recognized, a man performing composure. I walked out of the courtyard. Behind me, I heard him begin to recover, to address the crowd. To reframe, he was good. I didn't stay to counter him. I'd said what I could say. I'd planted the seed. When I got home that evening, I opened a forum account I'd created for exactly this purpose and wrote the post. I kept it specific. The address, the dates, the description of what he was selling and what he was taking, his name, the apartment number. I described the cold preparation supply I knew from watching his orders come in. He'd been building in the basement of the apartment, the good heaters, the real gear, all of it for him and Monica. I tagged the local community board. I flagged it for the building's management company. I linked it to the city's consumer protection office. Then I drove back to the villa and checked on the furnace. The cold came at midnight on January 31st. I was in the basement when the temperature started its drop. I'd set up a weather station, 4 outdoor sensors at different distances from the villa, and I watched the numbers in real time on a tablet screen while the furnace ran beside me. 40 degrees to 22 below zero in 30 minutes. By morning, 80 below. I'd known the numbers, but seeing them on screen was still something. The instruments went a little strange at the extremes, flickering. Struggling with readings, they hadn't been calibrated to record. By day 3, the official reports from the one remaining active broadcast station confirmed minus 100 degrees Celsius. I made myself soup over the wood stove because the numbers on a screen feel different when your hands are wrapped around something warm. The forum post had gone somewhere. I found out later, weeks later, from a radio broadcast when signals started returning, that it had circulated significantly before the cold hit. Not universally. Some residents had believed Ethan, or had been convinced by the timeline, or had simply not seen the warning in time. Some had listened. The Garcias had kept their space heater. I found out later they'd survived in their apartment by running it in the bedroom with the door sealed, 12 days on a single heater's worth of warmth while their building bled heat around them. I thought about that often. What happened in the courtyard, I heard only in pieces in the weeks after. The mob formed on the second morning. The forum post had given them the framework and the cold had given them the fury. I don't have complete information and I won't pretend to. I know the building sustained significant damage to the main entrance. I know neither Ethan nor Monica's names appeared on any survivor registration. I didn't watch it. I'd done what I could for the neighbors. The rest was theirs. For the next 18 months, I lived in the villa. I want to be honest. There were hard days. Weeks in the middle of the freeze when the wind turbine sound became a kind of madness, and the basement felt smaller than it was, and I cataloged my supplies for the 4th time in a week just to have something to do with my hands. Isolation is a serious thing. I took it seriously. I kept a journal. Every day, even on the days when the entry was 2 sentences. Even on the days when the entry was just the temperature and what I'd eaten. The act of writing it down, of making a record, felt important in ways I couldn't fully articulate. I grew herbs in the greenhouse. The attached structure stayed warm enough, barely, for rosemary and thyme and a stubborn variety of mint that seemed determined to outlast everything. I dried them and kept them in labeled jars and used them more than I needed to, probably, because the smell of fresh herbs was one of the most ordinary and essential things I could think of. I did yoga in the basement, badly, with no instructor and a body that wasn't used to it. But I did it because movement felt necessary, and I'd read enough about extended isolation to know that the body's routine matters as much as the mind's. I made myself laugh a few times at my own technique. That felt good too. The wind turbine turned through the blizzard. I watched it from the basement window, that slow rotation in impossible cold, and thought about stubbornness as a survival characteristic. When the cold broke, it came slowly. Not the dramatic release I might have imagined. Just a morning when the outdoor sensors read 20 below instead of 60, and then a week when the thermometer climbed by increments so small they felt cruel, and then a day when I opened the basement's ground-level window and didn't immediately need to close it. I walked outside on a gray March morning, mud under the snow where it was starting to compact. The air smelled like winter metal, and underneath it, the faint green suggestion of things that had survived. I was the only one in the neighborhood who had prepared correctly. That's not pride, it's a fact. I'd used my professional skills and my knowledge and my resources, and I'd prepared. Other people had skills and knowledge and resources too, and they'd been lied to by someone they trusted in the crucial window. That is not their failure. That is his. She didn't need to punish him. She just needed to tell the truth. The cold did the rest. 3 months after the thaw, I opened a new real estate office. Smaller than the last one room, one employee, Petra, who had prepared, who had done what I'd suggested, who was very much alive and looking for work. I specialized in sustainable housing, passive solar design, thermal mass construction, the kind of buildings that don't depend entirely on a grid that might not always be there. There was a lot of work.